Some men don't just worship death, they become its messenger. What happens when devotion turns into damnation? Welcome to True Crime Headquarters, where every story runs darker than the last, and the truth is always colder than fiction. I'm truly glad you're here. Whether you're watching from New York, South Africa, Canada, the Philippines, the UK, Greece, Sweden, New Zealand, or any of the countless places I can't name one by one, know this: I see you, I appreciate you, and you're part of this growing family. These stories are crafted to reach those who crave truth in the quiet hours. People who unwind, think, and fall asleep with mystery lingering in their minds. But when you only watch without subscribing, liking, or commenting, these stories don't travel far. They stay hidden when they should be heard. It costs nothing to hit subscribe, drop a like, or leave a thought below. But that small action keeps this channel alive and lets me keep sharing the dark, the true, and the untold. So, if these stories speak to you, please take a moment. It means everything, and it helps keep the truth alive. So, have you subscribed yet? I'm waiting. Done? Great. Thank you. I want you to know that every click and comment counts, and you are very important and highly welcomed heir. This is the story of Marcelo Antelo, the San La Muerte killer. We're about to descend into the twisted mind of a man who believed a saint of death gave him permission to kill. Marcelo Antelo didn't just take lives. He offered them as sacrifices, convinced that with each murder, he was securing his own immortality. This is the story of a killer who prayed before he struck, who carved symbols into flesh, and who transformed the streets of Argentina into his own personal altar of blood. The San La Muerte killer didn't hunt randomly. He hunted with purpose, with ritual, with a terrifying conviction that every scream, every drop of blood, every final breath was a holy act. Tonight, we enter the darkness where faith becomes madness, and devotion becomes murder. I know you love falling asleep to these stories, and tonight you're in for something truly chilling. We'll be exploring 4 haunting true crime cases, each one darker than the last. So, get cozy, unwind, and let the day melt away. But before you drift off, please don't forget to like, subscribe, share, and comment, and tell us where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. Now, close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let's begin. The Parana River moves slowly through northeastern Argentina, carrying secrets in its muddy currents. Along its banks, where the water meets the earth, strange shrines appear. Small collections of red cloth, cigarettes, candles, and skeletal figures carved from bone. These are offerings to San La Muerte, the skeletal saint of death, a folk deity worshipped by those dwelling on society's frayed edges. The Catholic Church refuses to recognize him. The government dismisses him as superstition. But in the slums and forgotten corners of Resistencia, Corrientes, and Formosa, San La Muerte is very real. And in 1996, one man took that devotion further than anyone imagined possible. Marcelo Antelo grew up surrounded by death, not metaphorically, but literally. His childhood home sat adjacent to a cemetery in the struggling outskirts of Resistencia, capital of Chaco province. Every morning, he watched funeral processions. Every night, he heard mourners wailing beyond the walls. While other children played soccer in dusty streets, Marcelo wandered among the tombstones, tracing names with small fingers, wondering about the lives that ended beneath the ground. His mother practiced the old ways. She kept a small shrine in their home, a skeletal figure no larger than a thumb, wrapped in red fabric and surrounded by offerings of alcohol and tobacco. She whispered prayers to San La Muerte, asking for protection, for money, for mercy in a world that offered none. She taught Marcelo that death wasn't an ending but a transformation, that San La Muerte watched over those whom God forgot, that the saint could grant miraculous favors to the faithful. But something in Marcelo interpreted these teachings differently. Where his mother saw spiritual comfort, he saw opportunity. Where she saw devotion, he saw permission. By the time Marcelo reached adolescence, his relationship with San La Muerte had evolved into something darker, more intimate. He spent hours before the shrine, not just praying but conversing. Convinced he could hear the saint's voice whispering through the candlelight. He carved his own figures from bone he collected near the cemetery. Dog bones, cattle bones, anything he could find. He scarred his own skin with crude tattoos of skeletal figures, marking himself as a devotee, transforming his body into a living shrine. The other kids avoided him. There was something wrong in his eyes, a vacancy, a distance, as though he existed partially in another realm. Teachers noted his disturbing drawings. Skeletal figures surrounded by bleeding bodies, churches burning, rivers running red. His mother grew concerned but dismissed it as artistic expression. She didn't realize she had nurtured something monstrous. At 17, Marcelo committed his first act of violence. A neighborhood dog that barked too loudly, disturbing his prayers. He lured it with scraps of meat, then strangled it slowly, watching its eyes dim, feeling its life pulse fade beneath his hands. Afterward, he placed the body before his San La Muerte shrine as an offering. He waited for guilt, for horror, for some normal human reaction. Instead, he felt exhilaration. He felt connected. He felt chosen. The voices grew stronger after that. Not metaphorical whispers, but clear instructions, or so Marcelo believed. San La Muerte was speaking directly to him, demanding more substantial offerings. Animals weren't enough. The saint wanted human sacrifice. He wanted blood, pain, devotion proven through murder. And Marcelo Intello, isolated and disturbed, willing to believe anything that made him feel special, listened. His first human victim was a homeless man who slept near the cemetery gates. Marcelo watched him for weeks, studying his routines, noting that nobody checked on him, that his absence would barely register in a community where people disappeared regularly into poverty, migration, or violence. On a moonless night in April 1996, Marcelo approached with a homemade knife, a sharpened piece of metal wrapped in cloth. He didn't hesitate. He struck quickly, brutally, driving the blade repeatedly into the man's torso while whispering prayers to San La Muerte. The homeless man fought back, gasping, clawing at his attacker's face. Blood sprayed across Marcelo's shirt, warm and sticky. But Marcelo felt no panic, no fear. Instead, he experienced what he would later describe as religious ecstasy, a sensation of being outside himself, watching his hands work, feeling divinely guided. When the man finally stopped moving, Marcelo carved a crude symbol into his chest, a skeletal figure representing San La Muerte, marking the body as a sacred offering. He dragged the corpse to the cemetery and buried it in a shallow grave near the boundary wall, covering it with loose dirt and debris. Then he returned home, stripped naked, washed the blood away, and knelt before his shrine for hours, thanking San La Muerte for accepting his gift, begging for more guidance, more purpose, more power. The body wasn't discovered for 3 weeks. When cemetery workers finally noticed the disturbed earth and the overwhelming stench, local police investigated half-heartedly. A dead homeless man, no identification, no family searching for him. It barely warranted paperwork. The carved symbol on his chest was noted but dismissed as gang violence or drug-related ritual. Nobody connected it to the quiet young man who lived nearby and spent his days carving bone figures. This lack of attention emboldened Marcelo. If the first murder drew no consequences, why not continue? San La Muerte demanded more offerings. The saint had chosen him as an instrument, a holy weapon in the mortal world. Who was he to refuse? Over the following months, Marcelo's ritual evolved. He began selecting victims more carefully, not just vulnerable targets, but those he deemed worthy sacrifices. Prostitutes working the dark streets, addicts too intoxicated to fight back, migrants passing through Resistencia with no local connections, people whose deaths would generate minimal investigation, whose disappearances fit existing patterns of violence and tragedy. But Marcelo wasn't simply killing. He was performing rituals, elaborate ceremonies that grew more complex with each murder. He would fast for days beforehand, purifying himself. He would spend hours in prayer, asking San La Muerte to guide his hand. He carried his bone figures with him, pressing them against victims' foreheads before striking, believing this transferred their life force to the saint. After each killing, he would carve the skeletal symbol deeper, more precisely, turning bodies into religious texts written in mutilated flesh. He collected trophies, not for sexual gratification like many serial killers, but as sacred relics. A finger bone here, a tooth there, small pieces of his victims that he incorporated into new San La Muerte figures. His bedroom shrine grew increasingly elaborate. Dozens of carved figures, candles perpetually burning, blood-stained cloth arranged in geometric patterns, photographs of victims he'd stolen from their belongings arranged like icons. His mother noticed the changes but misinterpreted them as increased devotion. She was pleased that her son had found spiritual purpose, not realizing that purpose was murder. When she asked about the locked box beneath his bed, he told her it contained religious artifacts too sacred to share. She accepted this explanation, never imagining the box held bones, teeth, and jewelry torn from corpses. By the end of 1996, Marcelo Intello had killed at least 7 people, though the exact number remains disputed. Some bodies were discovered. Others disappeared completely, consumed by the river or buried in unmarked graves throughout Chaco province. Police had begun noticing patterns, similar stab wounds, similar victim profiles, similar carved symbols, but lacked resources and political pressure to investigate thoroughly. These were nobodies being killed, people on the margins, people whose deaths didn't threaten respectable citizens or attract media attention. Marcelo interpreted this lack of pursuit as divine protection. San La Muerte was shielding him, rendering him invisible to authorities, allowing him to continue his holy work. He grew bolder, taking greater risks, killing in less isolated locations. His confidence transformed into arrogance. He began leaving more obvious clues, perhaps subconsciously desiring recognition, wanting the world to acknowledge his devotion. What Marcelo didn't realize was that one detective had noticed. Inspector Carlos Medina, a 20-year veteran of the Chaco police force, had started connecting the murders. The skeletal carvings troubled him. They were too consistent, too deliberate to be coincidental. He began researching San La Muerte, interviewing practitioners, learning about the folk saint's role in local culture. And slowly, carefully, he began building a profile of someone who took the devotion too far, someone who believed they had divine permission to kill. Medina started watching the cemeteries, the shrines, the places where San La Muerte worshippers gathered. He interviewed families of victims, searching for connections. And eventually, a pattern emerged. Several victims had been seen near the cemetery in Resistencia shortly before disappearing. Witnesses described a thin young man with scarred arms, always alone, always watching. The trap was set. All that remained was waiting for the killer to emerge from the shadows and claim his next victim. But Marcelo Intello, lost in his religious delusions, convinced of his own invincibility, had no idea the net was closing around him. He was too busy planning his next offering, his next demonstration of faith, his next murder. The skeletal saint, carved from bone and wrapped in red cloth, stared at him from the shrine with empty eye sockets. And Marcelo Intello, on his knees before it, bleeding from self-inflicted cuts on his arms, promised to deliver more souls, more blood, more proof of his unwavering devotion. Death had found its disciple, and that disciple was preparing to strike again. Rosa Martinez was 23 years old when she became Marcelo Intello's 8th victim. She worked as a seamstress in Resistencia's garment district, taking 3 buses each way to reach the factory where she spent 12-hour shifts hunched over industrial sewing machines. She was saving money to bring her daughter from her hometown in Santiago del Estero province. She dreamed of a better life, of education for her child, of escaping the cycle of poverty that had trapped her family for generations. She never imagined those dreams would end on a cold night in January 1997, at the hands of a man who believed he was doing God's work. Marcelo had been watching Rosa for 2 weeks. He noticed her routine. The late-night walk from the bus stop to her boarding house, always alone, always exhausted, taking a shortcut through an area near the cemetery to save 10 minutes. He interpreted her appearance in his hunting ground as a sign from San La Muerte. The saint had delivered her to him. She was meant to be sacrificed. But Rosa was different from his previous victims. She wasn't homeless, wasn't an addict, wasn't someone existing on society's absolute margins. She had a job, a family, people who would search for her. Killing Rosa represented an escalation, a step into more dangerous territory. And Marcelo knew it. He prepared for 3 days, fasting completely, drinking only water mixed with dirt from cemetery graves. He cut new patterns into his arms with a razor blade, scarification rituals he believed amplified his connection to San La Muerte. He crafted a new bone figure, this one more elaborate than previous versions, with a silver coin pressed into its skull and wrapped in fabric torn from his own clothing. This figure, he decided, would be left with Rosa's body. A signature, a declaration, a message that San La Muerte's chosen instrument was at work. On the night he chose for the killing, Marcelo positioned himself in the shadows along Rosa's usual path. He wore dark clothing and carried a new knife, purchased specifically for this sacrifice. A hunting blade with a 6-inch serrated edge, capable of inflicting devastating wounds. He also brought rope, in case he needed to restrain her, and a cloth soaked in chemicals, though he preferred victims to be conscious during the ritual, to feel the transformation from life to death. Rosa appeared at 11:47 p.m., walking quickly, her jacket pulled tight against the winter cold. She was humming softly, some song from her childhood, thinking about her daughter, imagining the reunion they'd have in just a few more months. She didn't notice the figure emerging from the darkness behind her until his hand clamped over her mouth and the knife pressed against her throat. "Don't scream," Marcelo whispered. "San La Muerte has chosen you. You should be honored." Rosa's eyes went wide with terror. She tried to struggle, but the knife bit into her skin, drawing blood. Marcelo dragged her backward, off the path, toward a cluster of trees that bordered the cemetery. She clawed at his arms, kicked at his shins, fought with desperate strength. But Marcelo was stronger, fueled by adrenaline and religious fervor, convinced that any resistance was merely the flesh struggling against its spiritual destiny. He threw her to the ground, pinning her with his body weight. Rosa tried to scream, but he stuffed the chemical-soaked cloth into her mouth, muffling her cries. Tears streamed down her face as Marcelo began his ritual, pulling out the bone figure, pressing it against her forehead, whispering prayers in a mixture of Spanish and Latin phrases he'd memorized from stolen religious texts. "Your death has meaning," he told her, his voice eerily calm. "You're being given to the saint. Your soul will feed his power. Through you I am blessed. Through me, you become eternal." Rosa's mind screamed denials, rejections, desperate pleas. This couldn't be happening. This was madness. She had a daughter waiting for her. She had plans, dreams, a future. She wasn't supposed to die in the dirt, murdered by a lunatic raving about saints and sacrifices. But Marcelo wasn't listening to her muffled protests. He was listening to voices only he could hear, commands from San La Muerte himself, instructions on how to properly conduct this holy killing. He raised the knife, held it above her chest, and began to pray louder, his voice rising to a chant, a ritualistic incantation that echoed through the empty night. Then something unexpected happened. Headlights swept across the area as a car turned onto the nearby street. The sudden illumination startled Marcelo, breaking his concentration. Rosa, sensing an opportunity, bit down hard on his hand and screamed, a muffled but audible cry that carried through the cold air. The car stopped. A door opened. A man's voice called out, "Hey! What's happening over there?" Panic flooded through Marcelo's religious ecstasy. This wasn't supposed to happen. San La Muerte was supposed to protect him, to ensure his rituals remained uninterrupted. The voices in his head screamed contradictory commands. Finish the sacrifice. Flee. Kill the witness. Hide the body. His hands trembled as he pressed the knife harder against Rosa's throat, torn between completing the ritual and saving himself. "I'm calling the police," the man shouted, his voice closer now, his footsteps audible on the gravel path. Marcelo made a decision. He slammed Rosa's head against the ground, stunning her, then fled into the cemetery's darkness, vaulting over the low wall and disappearing among the tombstones. Behind him, the Good Samaritan, a taxi driver named Jorge Fernandez, reached Rosa's crumpled form and immediately called for emergency services. Rosa Martinez survived. She was rushed to Hospital Parando with a punctured throat, severe bruising, and profound psychological trauma, but she lived. And when she regained consciousness the following morning, she provided police with a detailed description of her attacker. Thin, early 20s, multiple scars and crude tattoos on his arms, muttering about San La Muerte and sacrifices. Inspector Carlos Medina received the report within hours. This was the break he'd been waiting for, a survivor, a witness, a description that matched his emerging profile. He immediately organized a task force, pulling resources from neighboring jurisdictions, convincing reluctant administrators that a serial killer was operating in Resistencia and needed to be stopped before he killed again. But finding Marcelo wouldn't be simple. Resistencia sprawled across hundreds of square kilometers, its population exceeded 500,000, and its poorer districts were labyrinths of informal housing where police presence was minimal and community cooperation questionable. Marcelo could hide anywhere, could vanish into the city's underbelly, could wait weeks or months before emerging again. Unless he couldn't wait, unless his compulsion to kill, his need to complete interrupted rituals, drove him to take risks, to emerge from hiding, to offer San La Muerte another sacrifice to atone for his failure with Rosa Martinez. Marcelo, huddled in an abandoned building 3 kilometers from the cemetery, was experiencing exactly that compulsion. The interrupted ritual haunted him. He had failed. He had displeased San La Muerte. The voices in his head were no longer encouraging. They were angry, demanding, insistent. He needed to kill again, needed to complete a proper sacrifice, needed to prove his devotion was unshaken despite the previous night's disaster. He couldn't return home. By now, police had probably connected him to the attack, had probably searched his room, discovered his shrine, his trophies, his carefully maintained records of previous killings. His mother would be devastated or arrested or both. But none of that mattered. Only the ritual mattered. Only proving himself to San La Muerte mattered. He still had his knife, his bone figures, his absolute conviction that murder was a holy act. And Resistencia was full of potential victims, people whose lives meant less than his spiritual purpose, whose deaths would restore his standing with the skeletal saint. But Inspector Medina was also moving. Using Rosa's description, he canvassed neighborhoods near the cemetery, showing composite sketches, interviewing residents, searching for anyone who recognized the man. And finally, after 48 hours of intensive investigation, a name emerged. Marcelo Intello, a troubled young man who lived adjacent to the cemetery with his mother, who was obsessed with San La Muerte, who had been expelled from multiple jobs for disturbing behavior. Medina led a team to the Antello residence on January 23, 1997. They found Marcelo's mother in tears, surrounded by detectives who were documenting the horrific shrine in her son's bedroom. The bone figures arranged in circles, the blood-stained cloths, the photographs of victims, the trophies, human remains casually displayed like religious artifacts, the detailed journal where Marcelo had recorded each killing, each prayer, each moment he believed San La Muerte had spoken to him. But Marcelo himself was gone. A manhunt began immediately. Police flooded the area, checking abandoned buildings, interviewing known San La Muerte practitioners, watching the shrines and gathering places where devotees might shelter a fellow believer. Television stations broadcast Marcelo's photograph. Newspapers ran front-page stories about the San La Muerte killer. For the first time, Resistencia's population understood that a serial murderer had been operating among them for months. Marcelo watched these broadcasts from his hiding place, a condemned factory on the city's eastern edge. He saw his face on television, heard reporters describe his crimes, listened to experts analyze his psychology. Part of him felt pride. He was being recognized, acknowledged, feared. He had become significant, powerful, someone who mattered. But another part, the part still clinging to delusion, felt betrayed. San La Muerte was supposed to protect him. The saint was supposed to make him invincible. Why had he been exposed? Why had the ritual failed? The voices in his head offered no comfort now. Instead, they demanded a final sacrifice, an ultimate demonstration of faith that would restore everything, that would prove his devotion beyond doubt. They demanded that Marcelo offer himself. On the third night of the manhunt, a police patrol spotted Marcelo near the original cemetery, moving between tombstones, carrying his knife and remaining bone figures. When officers approached, he didn't flee. Instead, he dropped to his knees before a makeshift shrine, raised the knife, and began carving symbols into his own chest. The same skeletal figure he'd carved into his victims, now etched into his own flesh in a grotesque parody of devotion. "San La Muerte wants this," he screamed at the approaching officers. "My blood completes the ritual. My death feeds the saint." Inspector Medina, present at the scene, ordered his team to stand down. He approached slowly, carefully, speaking in a calm voice. "Marcelo, put down the knife. You need help. Let us help you." But Marcelo wasn't listening. He was beyond listening. The voices had consumed him completely. He raised the knife toward his own throat, preparing for the ultimate sacrifice, the final offering that would prove his faith and secure his place in San La Muerte's eternal favor. A single gunshot cracked through the cemetery. A police marksman positioned on higher ground had taken the shot, not to kill but to wound, to disarm. The bullet struck Marcelo's shoulder, spinning him around, the knife flying from his hand. He collapsed among the tombstones, bleeding, screaming, his religious delusions finally shattered by pain and reality. Officers swarmed forward, securing him, calling for medical assistance. As paramedics worked to stabilize his wounds, Marcelo continued muttering prayers, continued promising San La Muerte that he would sacrifice more, that he would prove his faith, that he was still worthy. But the skeletal saint, carved from bone and wrapped in red cloth, offered no response. It never had. The voices had always been Marcelo's own madness, his desperate need to feel chosen, special, significant in a world that had offered him nothing but poverty and isolation. The San La Muerte killer had been captured, but the horror he'd inflicted, the lives he'd destroyed, the families he'd devastated, those wounds would never fully heal. The psychiatric evaluation of Marcelo Antello began 3 weeks after his capture. Once his shoulder wound had healed sufficiently and he'd been cleared for psychological assessment, the task fell to Dr. Elena Vasquez, a forensic psychiatrist with 20 years of experience evaluating violent offenders throughout Argentina. She had examined murderers, rapists, terrorists, and cartel enforcers, but Marcelo Antello disturbed her in ways she hadn't anticipated. Their first session took place in a secured room at Hospital Neuropsychiatrico, with guards stationed outside and Marcelo restrained to his chair. He sat motionless when Dr. Vasquez entered, his eyes fixed on some distant point, his lips moving in silent prayer. The self-inflicted wounds on his chest had become infected during his brief period in hiding, leaving angry red scars that spelled out San La Muerte's skeletal form across his torso. "Marcelo," Dr. Vasquez began, settling into her chair with a notepad and recording device. "I'm Dr. Vasquez. I'm here to understand what happened, to understand your perspective. Will you talk to me?" For several minutes, he didn't acknowledge her presence. Then, without shifting his gaze, he spoke. "Are you a believer? A believer in what?" "In San La Muerte, in the saints that protect us when God turns away." Dr. Vasquez considered her response carefully. Confronting his delusions directly would likely cause him to retreat into silence. Building rapport required meeting him within his worldview, at least initially. "I know many people find comfort in San La Muerte," she answered. "Can you tell me about your relationship with the saint?" This opened a floodgate. Marcelo turned toward her, and for the first time, she saw the intensity in his eyes. Not violence, but fervent belief, the absolute conviction of someone who had touched what they believed was divine truth. He spoke for nearly 2 hours, describing his childhood beside the cemetery, his mother's teachings, the first time he heard San La Muerte's voice, the growing certainty that he had been chosen for a special purpose. "Everyone treats death like it's an ending," Marcelo explained, his voice eerily calm. "But it's not. It's a transformation. A doorway. San La Muerte guards that doorway. He decides who passes through, when, how. Most people fear him, but those who truly understand, who truly believe, we know he offers gifts. What kind of gifts? Dr. Vasquez asked. Protection, power, purpose. In a world where people like us don't matter, where we're poor and forgotten, San La Muerte gives us importance. He chose me. Out of everyone, he chose me to be his instrument. His instrument for what? For delivering souls. For performing the sacred transitions. The people I sent to him, they should be grateful. I gave them meaning. Their deaths weren't random violence. They were holy acts, rituals that connected the mortal world to the divine. Dr. Vasquez maintained her professional demeanor, but internally she was documenting the profound disconnect from reality, the complete lack of empathy, the elaborate delusional system that had allowed Marcelo to justify serial murder as religious devotion. This wasn't simple psychosis. This was a complex integration of cultural beliefs, personal trauma, and what appeared to be a severe personality disorder, possibly with schizotypal or borderline features. Did San La Muerte speak to you directly? She asked. Tell me about those experiences. Marcelo's expression softened, became almost beatific. Every day, especially during rituals, his voice was clear, commanding. He told me who to choose, when to strike, how to perform the sacrifices properly. He guided my hands during the carvings, helped me create the symbols that marked them as his property. Did you ever question whether the voice was real? The question triggered visible agitation. Marcelo's hands clenched, and his breathing quickened. Of course it was real. How else could I have done what I did? How else could I have chosen the right offerings, performed the rituals correctly? The saints spoke through me. But you were caught, Dr. Vasquez noted gently. If San La Muerte was protecting you, why did that happen? This question seemed to shatter something in Marcelo. His agitation transformed into anguish. Tears filled his eyes as he shook his head violently. I failed. The ritual with the woman, the one who survived, I let myself be distracted. I let the mortal world interfere with the sacred work. That's why everything fell apart. San La Muerte tested my faith, and I wasn't strong enough. So you believe your arrest was punishment for failing? Yes, but also a test. Another test. If I remain faithful, if I continue to honor the saint even here, even imprisoned, he'll reward me. He'll free me to complete the work. Dr. Vasquez recognized the danger in this thinking. Marcelo hadn't been cured by capture or the shattering of his previous existence. Instead, he'd incorporated these events into his delusional framework, reinterpreting them as divine challenges rather than consequences of his actions. He remained dangerous, still convinced murder was holy, still waiting for opportunities to kill again. Over subsequent sessions, Dr. Vasquez attempted to explore the psychological roots of Marcelo's delusions. She learned about his isolated childhood, his lack of meaningful relationships, his struggle to find identity or purpose in a society that offered limited opportunities for someone of his socio-economic status. San La Muerte had filled that void, providing Marcelo with the sense of specialness and significance he desperately craved. But understanding the origins didn't diminish the severity of his condition. Marcelo showed no remorse for his victims, no recognition that he had caused suffering, no capacity to empathize with the families he destroyed. When Dr. Vasquez showed him photographs of Rosa Martinez, the survivor, Marcelo expressed only frustration that the ritual had been interrupted, not concern for her trauma or relief that she'd lived. She was meant to die, he stated flatly. The interruption violated sacred law. Her continued existence is an insult to San La Muerte. Eventually, someone will need to correct that error. This casual discussion of future murder horrified Dr. Vasquez. She immediately documented it in her reports, emphasizing that Marcelo Antelo posed an extreme ongoing danger and should never be released into the community under any circumstances. Meanwhile, the criminal case against Marcelo was being constructed. Prosecutors faced significant challenges. While physical evidence connected him to Rosa Martinez's attack, and his journals provided detailed confessions to multiple murders. Several victims had never been found. Bodies buried in secret locations, dumped in the Parana River, or disposed of through methods Marcelo refused to disclose. Without bodies, securing murder convictions became legally complex. Additionally, Marcelo's obvious mental illness complicated prosecution strategies. Argentina's criminal code provided provisions for defendants who were legally insane at the time of their crimes, unable to understand the wrongfulness of their actions or control their behavior. Marcelo's attorneys, appointed by the state, argued that his severe delusions satisfied these criteria. He genuinely believed he was performing religious duties, not committing murders. He heard voices commanding his actions. He was, they argued, fundamentally disconnected from reality and therefore not criminally responsible. Prosecutors countered that Marcelo's elaborate planning, victim selection, and efforts to avoid detection demonstrated rational thinking and awareness that society condemned his actions. His delusions didn't prevent him from understanding that murder was illegal. They simply provided him with justification he valued more than legal prohibitions. He was, they argued, a deliberate killer who used religious delusions to excuse his homicidal desires. The legal battle consumed months. Expert witnesses testified about Marcelo's psychological condition, about San La Muerte's role in regional culture, about whether folk religious beliefs could constitute legitimate psychosis. The media coverage was intense, with tabloids printing sensational headlines about satanic rituals and cult killings, while more responsible outlets explored the complex intersection of poverty, mental illness, and religious syncretism that had produced Marcelo Intello. Rosa Martinez testified at a preliminary hearing, describing her attack in devastating detail. She had to face Marcelo across the courtroom, had to look at the man who had tried to murder her, who had pressed a knife against her throat and called her a holy offering. She trembled through her testimony, frequently pausing to collect herself, but she never wavered. She wanted him locked away forever, wanted to ensure he could never hurt anyone else. Marcelo showed no reaction during her testimony. He sat motionless, his eyes closed, his lips moving in silent prayer. Later, Dr. Vasquez would learn that he'd been praying to San La Muerte to strike Rosa dead in the courtroom, another sacrifice to prove his continued devotion. The families of confirmed victims also testified. A sister who had spent months searching for her disappeared brother, only to learn he'd been murdered and buried in an unmarked grave. A mother who recognized her son's jacket in a photograph from Marcelo's journal, confirming fears she'd harbored for over a year. These testimonies were agonizing, revealing the human cost of Marcelo's delusions, the devastation rippling outward from each killing. But perhaps the most disturbing testimony came from Marcelo's own mother. She appeared in court aged beyond her years, destroyed by guilt and grief, struggling to reconcile the son she'd raised with the monster he'd become. She described teaching him about San La Muerte as a protective spiritual practice, never imagining he would twist those teachings into justification for murder. She described finding the shrine in his bedroom, the human remains he'd collected, the realization that her son was responsible for the killings plaguing their community. "I taught him about faith," she sobbed. "I taught him that San La Muerte watches over us. I never taught him to kill. I never taught him that death was a gift to give. Where did I fail? How did my son become this?" Marcelo's only response, called out across the courtroom, was, "You didn't fail, mother. You showed me the truth. You introduced me to the saint. Everything I did with faith. You should be proud." The courtroom erupted. Victims' families screamed at Marcelo. Bailiffs had to restrain several people who lunged toward the defendant. The judge called for order, threatened to clear the courtroom, while Marcelo sat serene and undisturbed, convinced he had spoken truth. After 6 months of legal proceedings, the court reached its decision. Marcelo Intello was found guilty of 2 confirmed murders, multiple attempted murders including the attack on Rosa Martinez, and desecration of human remains. However, due to his severe mental illness, he was sentenced not to a conventional prison but to indefinite psychiatric confinement in a maximum security facility for the criminally insane. The verdict satisfied no one. Victims' families wanted him executed or imprisoned forever in the harshest conditions possible. Defense attorneys worried about the quality of psychiatric care he would receive. Prosecutors believed the sentence was too lenient given the severity of his crimes. And Marcelo himself responded with eerie calm, informing the court that San La Muerte would eventually secure his release, that his sacred work wasn't finished, that one day he would complete the interrupted rituals and offer the saint the sacrifices he was owed. Dr. Vasquez, who had spent months evaluating Marcelo, watched the sentencing with professional detachment masking deep unease. She had encountered many dangerous minds during her career, but Marcelo Antelo's combination of religious delusion, complete lack of empathy, and persistent homicidal ideation represented an extraordinary threat. In her final report, she wrote, "Patient Antelo demonstrates profound psychological disturbance centered on religious delusions that justify and compel homicidal behavior. He has shown no progress toward insight, no reduction in delusional intensity, and no development of empathy for victims. His belief system is impervious to rational intervention. He requires permanent high-security confinement with intensive psychiatric monitoring. Under no circumstances should he ever be released into the community. The risk of reoffending is absolute." As Marcelo was led from the courtroom to begin his indefinite psychiatric confinement, he turned back toward the gallery, toward the victims' families, toward Rosa Martinez sitting among them, and smiled. Not a sneer or a smirk, but a genuine, peaceful smile. "San La Muerte protects his faithful," he called out. "This isn't the end. It's just another test." Then he was gone, swallowed by the prison system, vanishing into the secure psychiatric facility where Argentina kept its most dangerous minds. But his words lingered in the courtroom, a chilling promise that echoed in the minds of everyone who heard it, because Marcelo Antelo truly believed what he'd said. And belief, when twisted by madness and sharpened by religious fervor, can survive any imprisonment. The Unidad de Detención Psiquiátrica San Rafael sits on 30 isolated acres outside Córdoba, surrounded by triple fencing, guard towers, and kilometers of empty grassland designed to make escape impossible. This is where Argentina sends the monsters too broken for prison, too dangerous for standard psychiatric care. Men who killed children, women who poisoned entire families, individuals whose minds exist in realities where murder is logic and horror is divine mandate. Into this fortress, in June 1997, came Marcelo Antelo. He was assigned to Sector C, the most restrictive wing, where patients spent 23 hours daily in solitary cells and emerged only for supervised exercise, meals, and mandatory therapy sessions. His cell measured 3 meters by 4 meters, a concrete box containing a bed bolted to the floor, a metal toilet, a small sink, and nothing else. The walls were painted institutional beige. A single reinforced window, too narrow for a human body to pass through, offered a view of nothing but empty sky. For most prisoners, such isolation would constitute psychological torture. But Marcelo adapted within days. He didn't need external stimulation. His entire world existed inside his head, populated by the voice of San La Muerte, by memories of his rituals, by fantasies of future sacrifices. The cell wasn't a prison. It was a monastery, a sacred space where he could commune with his skeletal saint without interruption. The staff noticed immediately that Marcelo was different from other patients. Most displayed visible distress. They screamed, banged on doors, begged for human contact, cycled through depression and rage. Marcelo remained calm, almost serene. He spent hours sitting motionless on his bed, staring at the wall, his lips moving in constant prayer. When Dr. Miranda Castillo, the facility's chief psychiatrist, conducted her initial assessment, she found him disturbingly content. "How are you adjusting to the facility?" she asked during their first session, conducted in a secured therapy room with guards stationed outside. "This place doesn't matter," Marcelo replied. "I'm exactly where I need to be. San La Muerte has placed me here for a reason." "What reason is that?" "To test my faith, to see if I remain devoted even when separated from the world, from opportunities to serve him. And I do. My devotion hasn't wavered." Dr. Castillo recognized the familiar pattern from his previous evaluations, the impenetrable delusional system, the reframing of reality to support his worldview. She initiated him on antipsychotic medications, hoping to reduce the intensity of his auditory hallucinations and potentially create space for therapeutic intervention. But Marcelo refused to swallow the pills. Staff had to forcibly administer injections, restraining him while he shouted that they were trying to silence San La Muerte's voice to separate him from his saint. The medications had minimal effect. For most schizophrenic patients, properly dosed antipsychotics could significantly reduce hallucinations and delusional thinking. But Marcelo's condition wasn't purely neurochemical. His delusions were deeply rooted in his identity, his sense of purpose, his fundamental understanding of reality. The drugs dulled him slightly, slowed his speech and movements, but they didn't silence the voice in his head or diminish his conviction that he was a chosen instrument of death. Within 3 months of his arrival, Marcelo had achieved something remarkable and deeply disturbing. He had begun converting other patients to worship San La Muerte. It started during communal exercise periods, when Sector C patients were allowed into a small courtyard for 30 minutes of supervised outdoor time. Marcelo would position himself near other inmates, speaking quietly about the skeletal saint, about protection and power and purpose. He targeted the most vulnerable, men with severe cognitive deficits, with limited education, with religious backgrounds that made them receptive to folk Catholic syncretism. Diego Ruiz was his first convert. Diego had murdered his stepfather during a psychotic episode, convinced the man was a demon sent to destroy his family. He existed in a fragmented reality where spiritual warfare was literal and constant. When Marcelo told him about San La Muerte, about a saint who fought against demons and protected the faithful, Diego listened with desperate attention. Here was a framework that made sense of his internal chaos, a belief system that validated his perceptions. Marcelo taught Diego prayers to San La Muerte, whispered during exercise periods and meal times. He described how to create makeshift shrines using whatever materials could be obtained: torn fabric from clothing, small stones arranged in patterns, scratches on cell walls forming skeletal figures. He shared his theology of death as transformation, of murder as sacred duty, of their imprisonment as divine testing. The guards noticed Diego's behavior changing. He became more animated, more focused. He scratched symbols into his cell walls, crude skeletal figures mimicking the ones Marcelo had carved into his victims. During therapy sessions, he began talking about San La Muerte, about feeling chosen, about hearing a voice that gave him instructions. Dr. Castillo immediately recognized what was happening. Marcelo Intello, despite being confined to the most restrictive psychiatric facility in Argentina, was creating a cult. She ordered his immediate isolation from all other patients, canceled his exercise privileges, and increased his medication dosages. But the damage was done. Diego continued his devotions. And worse, 2 other patients had also been exposed to Marcelo's teachings and were showing similar behavioral changes. The facility implemented emergency protocols. Marcelo was moved to an even more isolated cell, with no windows facing the courtyard, no opportunities for contact with other inmates. His meals were delivered through a slot in the door. His therapy sessions were reduced to conversations conducted through reinforced glass. He was effectively buried alive within the institution. But isolation didn't silence Marcelo. It amplified him. Alone in his cell, he escalated his devotions. He used his fingernails to scratch skeletal figures across every surface: walls, floor, even the underside of his bed frame. He tore strips of fabric from his bedding and braided them into crude rosaries, praying on each knot for hours. He cut himself with sharp edges found in his cell. A screw he'd loosened from the bed frame, a piece of broken plastic from his meal tray, creating fresh scarification patterns across his torso, arms, and legs. The self-mutilation became so severe that staff found him unconscious from blood loss on 2 separate occasions. He was rushed to the medical wing, stabilized, and returned to his cell with additional restrictions. But Marcelo interpreted these near-death experiences as spiritual victories, moments when he had touched the boundary between life and death, when San La Muerte had been closest, when he had proven his absolute devotion. Dr. Castillo attempted every intervention in her considerable toolkit. She tried different medication combinations. She organized intensive therapy focusing on cognitive behavioral techniques. She brought in priests and religious counselors, hoping that Orthodox Catholic teaching might counter Marcelo's distorted folk beliefs. Nothing worked. Marcelo remained locked in his delusional system, convinced that every hardship was a test, every restriction a divine challenge, every day of imprisonment another opportunity to prove his faith. Years passed. 1998 became 1999, then 2000. Marcelo Intello remained in psychiatric confinement, largely forgotten by the general public as new crimes and new monsters captured media attention. But within the secure facility, he had become legendary, a cautionary example of how severe religious delusions could create an absolutely intractable patient. Then, in April 2001, something changed. A new patient was transferred to Sector C. Fernando Vega, a former police officer who had murdered 3 colleagues during a psychotic break, claiming they were part of a conspiracy to destroy him. Fernando was violent, paranoid, and had assaulted multiple staff members at his previous facility. The decision was made to place him in maximum isolation, in a cell adjacent to Marcelo Intello's. The 2 men couldn't see each other, but they could hear through the walls. And Marcelo, after years of forced silence, had found a new audience. He began speaking to Fernando through the concrete, quietly at first, testing whether the other man would respond. Fernando, isolated and desperate for human contact, answered, and thus began a twisted dialogue between 2 severely disturbed minds. Marcelo described San La Muerte, described his rituals, described the power that came from absolute devotion to death. Fernando, whose paranoid delusions had left him feeling powerless and persecuted, found this appealing. A saint who protected the faithful? A belief system where violence wasn't pathology but sacred duty? This resonated with his fractured worldview. Over months, communicating through walls, Marcelo converted Fernando to his death cult. He taught him prayers, described rituals, shared his theology of murder as holy transformation. And Fernando, lacking the structured delusions that had previously defined his psychosis, adopted Marcelo's framework completely. The guards didn't realize what was happening until Fernando attempted to murder a psychiatric aide during a routine medication delivery. He attacked with stunning viciousness, trying to strangle the woman while screaming prayers to San La Muerte. It took 3 guards to subdue him, and the aide barely survived. During the investigation that followed, Fernando explained calmly that Marcelo Intello, the holy prophet in the next cell, had instructed him that San La Muerte required a sacrifice, that killing the aide would prove his devotion and earn him divine protection. He had been tested and had acted correctly. The facility erupted in crisis response. Marcelo was immediately transferred to a different wing, placed in a cell with soundproofed walls, forbidden from communicating with any other patients under any circumstances. His case file was updated with warnings that he represented not just a danger to potential victims, but an ideological contagion capable of transforming vulnerable psychotic individuals into his violent disciples. Dr. Castillo, now 10 years into treating Marcelo, wrote in her updated assessment, "Patient Antello has demonstrated an unprecedented ability to recruit followers even under conditions of extreme isolation. His religious delusions are not merely personal pathology. They constitute a transmissible belief system capable of radicalizing other severely mentally ill individuals toward violence. He has weaponized his psychosis." But even this additional isolation didn't stop Marcelo. He continued his devotions alone, continued scratching symbols into every surface, continued his self-mutilation rituals, continued believing that one day San La Muerte would free him to complete his sacred work. Outside the facility, life continued without him. Rosa Martinez, the survivor, had moved to Buenos Aires and rebuilt her life. She worked as an advocate for crime victims, speaking about her experience, helping others navigate trauma. She gave occasional interviews about the attack, always emphasizing that while Marcelo Intello had tried to kill her body, she refused to let him murder her spirit. The families of confirmed victims held annual remembrance ceremonies, gathering at the cemetery in Resistencia where several bodies had been discovered. They planted trees, placed flowers, demanded that authorities continue searching for remains of victims still missing. Some families never received closure, never found their loved ones, left to wonder about unmarked graves and river burials and the secrets Marcelo and Tello refused to share. Inspector Carlos Medina, the detective who had captured Marcelo, retired from the police force in 2003. He gave a final interview to a true crime magazine, reflecting on the case that had defined the latter part of his career. Marcelo Intello is the most dangerous type of killer, Medina said, not because he was particularly skilled or intelligent, but because he truly believed what he was doing was right. You can't rehabilitate absolute conviction. You can only contain it. Those words proved prophetic. As the years stretched into decades, 2005, 2010, 2015, Marcelo remained in psychiatric confinement, unchanged and unchangeable. Staff turnover meant new guards and therapists encountered him without the historical context of his crimes. They saw only a middle-aged man, scarred and strange, who prayed constantly and scratched symbols on walls. They didn't fully grasp the monster contained in that cell. In 2018, a young psychiatric resident named Dr. Torres began conducting therapy sessions with Marcelo as part of his training in treating severe delusional disorders. Dr. Torres was idealistic, confident in modern therapeutic techniques, convinced that with proper treatment anyone could improve. He engaged Marcelo in conversations about his childhood, his trauma, his need to feel special. He carefully avoided directly challenging the San La Muerte delusions, instead trying to help Marcelo understand the psychological needs those delusions fulfilled. It was a sophisticated approach, grounded in contemporary trauma-informed care, and it backfired catastrophically. Marcelo interpreted Dr. Torres's empathy as spiritual curiosity. He began trying to convert the young doctor, describing San La Muerte's teachings, explaining how the saint could bring purpose and power, suggesting that Dr. Torres himself had been guided to Marcelo for a reason, perhaps to become a disciple, perhaps to help spread the faith beyond the facility's walls. Dr. Torres, alarmed by this turn, attempted to establish firmer professional boundaries. But Marcelo had already fixated on him as a potential convert, a new target for his proselytizing. He began writing letters to Dr. Torres, letters that had to be confiscated by staff, filled with detailed descriptions of rituals, prayers, and thinly veiled suggestions that Dr. Torres could serve San La Muerte by helping Marcelo escape. The situation culminated when Dr. Torres arrived for a scheduled session and found that Marcelo had used his own blood to paint skeletal figures across the walls of the therapy room during the previous night's cleaning shift. In the center of the largest figure, Marcelo had written in Spanish, "Dr. Torres, San La Muerte has chosen you. Join us." Dr. Torres requested immediate reassignment. He left the facility shortly thereafter and never returned to forensic psychiatry. The incident was documented as another example of Marcelo Intello's dangerous and persistent ability to manipulate vulnerable individuals toward his death cult ideology. By 2024, Marcelo had been confined for 27 years. He was now 50 years old, his body covered entirely in scars from decades of self-mutilation, his teeth damaged from years of inadequate dental care, his health deteriorating from the sedentary lifestyle of permanent isolation. But his mind remained as committed to San La Muerte as it had been when he'd committed his first murder in 1996. Staff sometimes wondered if he even remembered his victims anymore, the actual people whose lives he'd taken, or had they become abstractions, mere symbols in his delusional religious narrative, their individuality erased by his need to see them as holy offerings rather than human beings? Dr. Castillo, now approaching retirement after spending most of her career managing Marcelo's case, conducted a final evaluation in late 2024. She asked him directly, "After all these years, do you feel any remorse? Any guilt for what you did?" Marcelo considered the question seriously, as if genuinely trying to understand why she would ask. Then he answered with absolute sincerity, "How can I feel guilt for doing God's work? San La Muerte chose those people. I was just the instrument. If anything, I feel pride that I was faithful, that I served my purpose. My only regret is that I couldn't complete more rituals before I was stopped." "And if you were released tomorrow?" Dr. Castillo asked. "What would you do?" Marcelo smiled, that same peaceful, disturbing smile witnesses remembered from his trial. "I would return to the cemetery in Resistencia. I would rebuild my shrine, and I would offer San La Muerte the sacrifices I still owe him. The work isn't finished. It will never be finished. Death needs servants, and I answered that calling. I would answer it again." Dr. Castillo documented this final conversation in her closing report. She concluded with words that would remain in Marcelo Antelo's permanent file, a warning to any future administrator who might consider releasing him. This patient will never be safe for community reintegration. His delusional system has not diminished with time, treatment, or confinement. He remains and will always remain an active threat to public safety. Permanent psychiatric detention is the only appropriate disposition. As of 2025, Marcelo Antelo remains confined in Sector C of the Unidad de Detención Psiquiátrica San Rafael. He will likely die there, in that cell, alone with his delusions, his skeletal saint, his unshakable conviction that murder was his sacred duty. But the horror he inflicted lives beyond his cell. Rosa Martinez still wakes some nights feeling a knife against her throat, hearing whispered prayers about sacrifices and saints. The families of his victims still gather annually, still mourn losses that can never be recovered. The residents of Resistencia still remember the fear that gripped their city when the San La Muerte killer hunted their streets. And somewhere in the archives of Argentine criminal history, Marcelo Antelo's journals remain preserved as evidence. Page after page of detailed descriptions of murders, of prayers to death, of a mind so fractured by delusion that it transformed killing into worship. These documents serve as a reminder of how faith can be weaponized, how mental illness can be radicalized, how a belief system, any belief system, can be twisted to justify the unjustifiable. Marcelo Antelo didn't invent violence. He didn't create the concept of human sacrifice. He simply found a framework that allowed him to indulge his darkest impulses while convincing himself he was doing something holy. The skeletal saint never spoke to Marcelo Antelo. San La Muerte never commanded those murders, never accepted those sacrifices, never granted the power and protection Marcelo believed he'd received. The voice he heard was always his own, his need for significance, his hunger for purpose, his complete inability to recognize the humanity of others. But try telling that to Marcelo. Even now, decades later, he kneels in his cell and prays. He scratches symbols into walls. He cuts sacred patterns into his flesh. He waits for the day San La Muerte will finally free him to complete his divine mission. That day will never come. Marcelo Antelo will die in psychiatric confinement, taking his delusions to whatever grave awaits him, and the world will be safer for it. But his story remains, a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked delusion, untreated mental illness, and the terrible things humans can justify when they believe they're serving something greater than themselves. The San La Muerte killer is contained, but the darkness that created him still exists in the margins of society, waiting for the next vulnerable mind to infect, the next desperate soul seeking purpose in places where only horror lives. This is where the story ends. Not with redemption or understanding, but with a man locked away, still praying to death, still convinced that murder was his calling. Some monsters never change. They just get older, alone in cells, waiting for a salvation that will never arrive. If you're new here, welcome to the channel, where we dive into true crime stories with calmness and respect. A special shout out to my amazing subscribers who've been with me from the start. Thank you for your incredible support. If you're still with me, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Or just say hello so I know you're still here. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and hit subscribe so you won't miss any of our upcoming true crime stories perfect for winding down. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2, The Human Hyena, A Descent into Madness. The streets of Caracas held a secret that would make even the devil recoil. Between 2002 and 2004, a predator stalked Venezuela's capital with a hunger that defied human understanding. Roberto Jose Carmona earned a name that would echo through the darkest corridors of criminal history, the human hyena. This wasn't a nickname born from tabloid sensationalism. It was a title carved in blood, whispered in terror, and earned through acts so depraved that investigators would need psychiatric counseling after viewing the crime scenes. 23 souls vanished into his nightmare. 23 families received phone calls that shattered their worlds. And the method of his madness? Cannibalism. This is the story of how one man transformed from human being into something far worse. A walking nightmare that proved monsters don't just exist in folklore. They walk among us, smile at us, and sometimes they invite us to dinner. What you're about to hear will disturb you. It will haunt you, but it needs to be told because forgetting the victims means letting evil win twice. Caracas, Venezuela. A city where poverty and desperation painted the streets in shades of gray and brown, where the gap between the wealthy and the destitute stretched wider than the Caribbean Sea, where a man could disappear without anyone noticing for days, sometimes weeks. This was the hunting ground Roberto Jose Carmona chose, and he chose it well. Born in 1962, Roberto grew up in the shantytown barrios that clung to the hillsides surrounding Caracas like barnacles on a sinking ship. His childhood remains shrouded in shadow, a deliberate obscurity that some say began with the man himself. What little we know paints a portrait of dysfunction and violence. His father, a construction worker with hands calloused from labor and fists hardened from rage, ruled their cramped home with brutality that left scars both visible and hidden. His mother, broken by years of abuse, retreated into silence, her eyes vacant as she watched her son absorb every blow, every scream, every moment of horror that unfolded within those thin walls. School records show a boy of average intelligence but disturbing behavior. Teachers noted his fascination with dead animals found near the schoolyard. While other children played soccer or shared snacks, young Roberto would crouch over the carcass of a dog or cat, prodding it with sticks, his eyes gleaming with curiosity that seemed wholly inappropriate. When questioned, he would shrug, offering explanations that satisfied no one but couldn't quite be called threatening. He was simply interested, he claimed, simply curious about what existed inside the shell of flesh and bone. By his teenage years, Roberto had developed a reputation in his neighborhood. Locals whispered about missing pets, about strange smells emanating from abandoned buildings where he was seen entering. Nothing concrete ever materialized. No evidence solid enough for police intervention in a city where murders went unsolved daily. But the whispers persisted, growing louder, more insistent, until families began warning their children to avoid the young man with dead eyes and a smile that never reached them. His first confirmed victim came in 2002. His name was Carlos Perez, a 41-year-old homeless man who slept in the doorways of closed shops in the commercial district. Carlos had been a teacher once, before alcohol and tragedy stripped away his former life piece by piece. Now he survived on handouts and the occasional odd job, invisible to most who passed him on the street. But Roberto saw him. Roberto always saw the invisible ones. Witnesses would later recall seeing Roberto talking with Carlos on a humid evening in March. The conversation appeared friendly, even jovial. Roberto offered something: money, work, perhaps food, and Carlos followed him willingly into the maze of narrow streets that characterized the older sections of the city. No one thought anything of it. Why would they? Men talked. Men walked together. Nothing unusual. Nothing worth remembering. Carlos Perez was never seen alive again. His body was discovered 3 days later in a condemned building slated for demolition. A construction worker making a preliminary survey stumbled upon the scene and immediately vomited, his breakfast splashing across the concrete floor already stained with horrors. What he saw would require years of therapy to process, if processing such a thing was even possible. Carlos Perez had been systematically dismembered. His limbs were severed with crude precision, the cuts jagged and uneven, suggesting the use of a simple blade rather than any surgical instrument. But the dismemberment was only the beginning. Large portions of flesh had been removed from his thighs, his torso, his arms. Removed with purpose. Removed with intent. The teeth marks on the bones told a story that investigating officers initially refused to believe. Someone had eaten Carlos Perez. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, literally consumed portions of his body with a hunger that suggested this wasn't an act of desperation or survival. This was pleasure. This was satisfaction. This was an appetite being fed. Detective Maria Rodriguez caught the case. A 15-year veteran of the Caracas police force, she had seen murders in every form imaginable. Domestic violence escalated to lethal extremes. Gang executions designed to send messages. Crimes of passion committed in moments of temporary insanity. But this was different. This spoke of planning, of ritual, of a mind operating on a wavelength that existed outside normal human experience. The crime scene yielded minimal evidence. No fingerprints, the killer had been careful or lucky or both. No witnesses who remembered anything useful beyond the initial sighting of Roberto and Carlos together. No clear motive beyond the act itself. But there was something else. Something that made Maria's blood run cold as she stood in that abandoned building, breathing through her mouth to avoid the smell of death and decay. Scratches on the walls. Deep gouges in the concrete and plaster, made by human fingernails torn and bloody. Carlos hadn't died quickly. He had suffered. He had fought. He had scratched at the walls in desperation, trying to escape, trying to claw his way to freedom while his killer worked on him with methodical patience. The medical examiner's report confirmed what Maria already suspected. Carlos had been alive for hours during the initial stages of his ordeal. The wounds showed signs of crude cauterization, suggesting his killer had used fire or heat to stop the bleeding, to keep him conscious, to extend the experience. This wasn't murder. This was torture elevated to an art form, practiced by someone who derived satisfaction from every scream, every plea, every moment of absolute terror. But who? The investigation stalled almost immediately. Caracas police were overwhelmed with cases, understaffed and underfunded. One dead homeless man, however horrific the circumstances, couldn't command the resources needed for intensive investigation. Maria worked the case in her spare time, driven by something she couldn't quite articulate. Justice, perhaps, or maybe just the need to stop whatever had killed Carlos Perez before it killed again. She wouldn't have to wait long. 2 weeks later, another body was discovered, then another, then 2 more within 3 days of each other. All homeless, all male, all butchered and partially consumed in ways that made even hardened homicide detectives question their career choices. The city was under siege by a predator unlike any they had encountered before, and they didn't have the first clue about his identity. Roberto, meanwhile, continued his life with remarkable normalcy. He worked odd jobs, construction, moving services, anything that required physical labor but little oversight. He was polite to his employers, reliable enough to be hired repeatedly, forgettable enough that no one really knew him. He lived in a small apartment in the Cutia district, a working-class neighborhood where people minded their own business and asked no questions about strange smells or unusual activities. He had no friends, no romantic relationships, no social connections beyond the superficial interactions required for survival in urban society. But his apartment told a different story. The story of a man whose inner life diverged so drastically from his outer presentation that they seemed to exist in different dimensions entirely. Inside those walls, Roberto had created a shrine to his obsessions. Newspapers' clippings about missing persons covered one wall, each article carefully cut out and arranged in chronological order. Books on anatomy, butchery, and meat preservation lined makeshift shelves. And in the small closet that served as his pantry, containers held what police would later identify as human remains, preserved and stored with the same care a gourmet chef might lavish on expensive ingredients. He kept journals too, pages and pages of cramped handwriting detailing his thoughts, his urges, his carefully documented hunts. He wrote about the thrill of selection, of watching potential victims and evaluating them like livestock. He described the conversations he had with them, the false promises of work or food or shelter he used to lure them to private locations. He detailed the killings themselves with clinical precision, noting what worked and what didn't, refining his technique with each victim like a craftsman perfecting his trade. But most chilling were the passages where he wrote about the consumption. He described tastes and textures with the enthusiasm of a food critic reviewing a fine meal. He had preferences. Younger men were more tender, he noted, while older ones had a different quality he found appealing in other ways. He wrote about cooking methods, about seasonings, about the satisfaction that came not just from the eating but from the knowledge of what he was eating, of whose life he was literally consuming. By July 2002, the body count had reached 8. The media had begun paying attention, running stories about the Caracas cannibal that sent waves of panic through the city's homeless population. Shelters reported increased occupancy as people sought safety in numbers. The streets emptied earlier each evening as darkness fell. But Roberto adapted. He always adapted. He began targeting during daylight hours, using the crowds and chaos of busy streets to his advantage. He posed as a social worker, carrying a clipboard and wearing clothes that suggested official capacity. The homeless, accustomed to being processed through various governmental and charitable systems, followed him willingly when he promised housing assistance or medical care. By the time they realized their mistake, they were already in his control, already isolated, already dead. Detective Rodriguez knew they were dealing with a serial killer. The pattern was clear, the signature consistent. But knowing and proving were different things entirely. She needed a break in the case, needed something to connect these victims beyond the manner of their deaths. She worked 18-hour days, reviewing files, interviewing witnesses, walking the streets where victims were last seen. Her colleagues thought she was obsessed. They were right, but obsession was the only appropriate response to what was happening in their city. Then came the witness they needed. A street vendor named Paulo who sold arepas from a cart near Belas Arts metro station. He remembered seeing several of the victims in the days before they disappeared. More importantly, he remembered seeing them with the same man. Tall, thin, with a distinctive scar on his left forearm. The man who always wore the same faded blue baseball cap. The man who smiled too much but whose eyes remained completely cold. Paulo had noticed because the man bought arepas regularly, always paying exact change, always polite. But there was something wrong about him. Something Paulo couldn't articulate but felt instinctively. When shown composite sketches based on his description, Paulo nodded vigorously. That was him. That was the man who walked with the missing ones. Maria now had a description. More than that, she had a pattern of behavior. The killer frequented specific areas, had specific preferences, operated on a schedule. They could use this. They could find him. But Roberto was already planning his next hunt. Already watching. Already hungry. And the appetite of the human hyena had only begun to truly reveal itself. The summer of 2002 brought suffocating heat to Caracas. Temperatures soared above 95 degrees daily, turning the city into an oven that baked both the living and the dead. The heat accelerated decomposition, meaning bodies were discovered faster, their condition more deteriorated. For the investigation, this meant losing potential evidence. For Roberto Jose Carmona, it meant adapting his methods once again. Victim number 9 was discovered in August, and this one was different. This victim had a name people recognized, a face that appeared in the newspapers not as a crime statistic but as a person. Eduardo Sanchez, a 33-year-old construction worker who had been missing for 5 days. He wasn't homeless. He had an apartment, a girlfriend, a mother who called police daily demanding updates. His disappearance generated attention, pressure, resources. Eduardo's body was found in the Gare River, partially submerged and tangled in debris. The water had washed away potential evidence, but it couldn't erase the marks that told the story of his death. The same signature was there: dismemberment, missing flesh, teeth marks on bone. But there was something else too. Signs of prolonged captivity. Marks on his wrists and ankles consistent with restraints. Bruising that suggested beatings administered over several days. Eduardo hadn't been killed quickly. He had been kept alive, imprisoned, tortured for days before his death. And during that time, while his girlfriend was filing missing person reports and his mother was organizing search parties, Roberto was conducting his experiments in darkness and pain. The autopsy revealed more horrors. Eduardo's stomach contained his last meal. a mixture of rice, beans, and meat. Testing of the meat raised questions no one wanted to ask, but the answers came anyway through DNA analysis. The meat Eduardo had eaten before his death was human tissue, not his own, someone else's. Roberto had fed one victim to another before killing them both. This revelation sent shockwaves through the investigation. They weren't just hunting a cannibal. They were hunting someone whose depravity operated on levels most people couldn't fathom. Someone who derived pleasure not just from killing and eating, but from forcing his victims to participate in his grotesque rituals, whether they knew it or not. Detective Rodriguez assembled a task force. 5 detectives working full-time on what was now officially designated the human hyena case. A name leaked to the press by someone in the department, probably deliberately, to generate public pressure for results. The media attention was a double-edged sword. It brought resources and political will, but it also brought panic and misinformation. Soon, every suspicious death in Caracas was being attributed to the killer, even ones that clearly weren't connected. But the task force had advantages now. They had descriptions, patterns, and increasing forensic evidence. They began surveillance of areas where victims had last been seen. They distributed composite sketches to every police officer and security guard in the city. They set up a tip line that rang constantly with reports ranging from genuinely useful to utterly absurd. Roberto felt the pressure. For the first time, his careful anonymity was threatened. His face, or something approximating it, stared back at him from newspapers and television screens. People were looking for him, even if they didn't know they were looking at him. The city that had been his private hunting ground was becoming dangerous territory. Most killers would have stopped, gone dormant, waited for attention to fade. Roberto accelerated. September brought a rapid succession of victims. For bodies discovered within 2 weeks, each showing increasing levels of violence and mutilation. It was as if Roberto was racing against time, trying to satisfy an appetite that grew more ravenous with each feeding. Or perhaps he was sending a message. You can't stop me, you can't catch me, I am beyond your reach. Victim 13 was discovered in a state that traumatized even the most experienced forensic personnel. The body had been so thoroughly butchered that identification required dental records. Large portions were simply gone, consumed completely. What remained showed evidence of careful preparation. The body had been drained of blood, the organs removed and taken, the bones cleaned with almost professional efficiency. The crime scene told a story of ritualistic precision. Candles had been arranged in a circle around where the body was found. Strange symbols were drawn on the walls in what testing confirmed was the victim's blood. Whether Roberto was developing some twisted religious framework for his killings or simply adding theatrical elements for his own amusement was unclear. Either way, it suggested an escalating psychological deterioration, a descent into madness that had already claimed 13 lives and showed no signs of stopping. The psychological profile developed by a consultant psychiatrist painted a disturbing portrait. Roberto likely suffered from a combination of severe personality disorders, possible psychosis, and what the psychiatrist termed anthropophagic fixation, an obsession with consuming human flesh that went beyond any recognized paraphilia. He likely experienced no genuine empathy, no remorse, no connection to other humans as beings deserving of moral consideration. To him, people were objects, resources, food. But the profile also noted something more frightening: intelligence. Roberto had evaded capture for months while committing increasingly risky murders in an increasingly alert city. He adapted quickly to changing circumstances, modified his hunting patterns, learned from near misses. This wasn't a disorganized killer striking randomly in moments of uncontrolled rage. This was someone who planned, who thought strategically, who treated murder as a craft to be refined and perfected. October brought a breakthrough. A traffic camera near the Capitolio metro station captured footage of victim 14, Ricardo Morales, walking with an unidentified man. The man wore the blue baseball cap described by witness Paulo. The footage was grainy, the angle poor, but it was something. Forensic imaging specialists worked to enhance the video, to extract every possible detail from those pixelated frames. What they saw was chilling. As Ricardo and the man walked together, engaged in what appeared to be normal conversation, The man turned slightly toward the camera. For just a fraction of a second, his face was partially visible. Not enough for positive identification, but enough to see his expression. He was smiling. Not the warm smile of friendly conversation, but something else. Something predatory. Something triumphant. As if he knew he was being recorded and didn't care, or perhaps even enjoyed adding this evidence to the growing documentation of his crimes. The enhanced images were distributed citywide. "Have you seen this man?" Posters appeared on every corner, in every metro station, in every public space. The tip line exploded with calls. Hundreds of leads poured in daily. Most went nowhere, but each one had to be checked, investigated, eliminated. The task force worked around the clock, surviving on coffee and determination, and the desperate need to stop the killing before another body appeared. Roberto saw his image everywhere. The net was closing. But still he couldn't stop. Wouldn't stop. The hunger was too powerful, too consuming. It defined him now, shaped every thought and action. He was no longer Roberto Jose Carmona, struggling construction worker from the barrios. He was the human hyena, and the hyena needed to feed. Victim 15 was taken in broad daylight from a crowded market. Witnesses saw Roberto, though they didn't know it was him yet, helping an elderly man carry heavy bags of groceries. The man, Ernesto Lopez, was 72 years old, a retired postal worker who lived alone. Helpful strangers offering assistance to the elderly wasn't unusual. No one thought to intervene or question. By the time Ernesto's neighbors reported not seeing him for several days, it was too late. Ernesto's body was found in his own apartment. Roberto had taken him home, killed him there, and spent days in the apartment conducting his grotesque rituals while neighbors passed by the door, unaware of the horror unfolding mere feet away. The crime scene was the worst yet. Blood saturated the carpets. Body parts were stored in the refrigerator alongside normal groceries. The kitchen showed evidence of cooking, human tissue prepared with the same casual domesticity someone might use for preparing any meal. But Roberto made a mistake. A crucial, fatal mistake. He took something from Ernesto's apartment. A watch, a simple timepiece with sentimental value but little monetary worth. Whether he took it as a trophy or simply because he liked it was irrelevant. What mattered was that he wore it. And watches can be identified. A witness who had seen the helpful stranger with Ernesto at the market remembered the watch. Had noticed it because her late husband had owned one similar. When police released details of items missing from Ernesto's apartment, including the watch, she called the tip line immediately. She provided a detailed description, not just of the watch, but of the man wearing it. The description matched Paolo's. Matched the enhanced images from the traffic camera. Matched dozens of other witness statements that had seemed disconnected before but now formed a pattern. A web, a net drawing tight around Roberto Jose Carmona. The task force now had more than a description. They had a name. Anonymous tips from residents of Roberto's apartment building had mentioned a man matching the description. A man who kept odd hours, who brought home packages wrapped in plastic and duct tape, who sometimes could be heard talking to himself through the thin walls. The building superintendent provided Roberto's full name and apartment number. Detective Rodriguez felt the pieces falling into place. They had enough for a search warrant. Enough to move. She assembled a tactical team for the arrest, knowing they were dealing with someone extremely dangerous, someone who had nothing to lose. The raid was scheduled for dawn, when suspects were typically disoriented and less likely to resist or escape. But Roberto was already gone. Some instinct, the same predatory awareness that had kept him alive and free for so long, warned him. Maybe he saw surveillance he wasn't supposed to see. Maybe he simply felt the walls closing in. Whatever the reason, when police breached his apartment door on the morning of October 23, 2002, they found only evidence of his crimes, not the man himself. The apartment was a chamber of horrors. Freezers contained human remains. Journals detailed every murder. Photographs showed victims in various stages of captivity and death. News clippings covered the walls like grotesque wallpaper. And in the center of the small living room, laid out carefully on a table, was a place setting, plate, silverware, napkin, with a note that read simply, "The feast continues." Roberto Jose Carmona had fled. The human hyena was loose, somewhere in the city or beyond, hungry and hunting. And everyone knew that a cornered predator was the most dangerous kind. The discovery of Roberto's apartment transformed the investigation from a search for an unknown killer into a manhunt for a specific individual. His face, his real face, captured from identification photos, appeared on every television screen in Venezuela. The reward for information leading to his arrest climbed to 50,000 bolivares, an enormous sum that guaranteed every citizen would be watching, searching, hoping to claim both the money and the hero status of catching the human hyena. But Roberto had advantages. He knew the city intimately, knew its hidden corners and forgotten spaces. He had prepared for this possibility, maintained emergency supplies, established bolt holes where he could disappear. And most importantly, he had nothing left to lose. A man facing dozens of murder charges, facing certain life imprisonment or execution, becomes capable of anything. The evidence recovered from his apartment allowed investigators to connect him definitively to 15 murders, with strong circumstantial evidence linking him to 8 more. The journals were particularly damning. Detailed accounts written in his own hand, describing not just the mechanics of each killing but his emotional response, his satisfaction, his hunger. Reading them was like peering into an abyss that stared back with malevolent intelligence. Forensic psychologists who analyzed the journals noted a disturbing evolution. Early entries were tentative, almost apologetic, as if Roberto was still grappling with the enormity of what he was doing. But over time, the tone shifted. Guilt or hesitation disappeared, replaced by confidence and pride. He began referring to himself in the third person, calling himself the hyena, and describing his actions as feeding rather than killing. The psychological disintegration was complete. Roberto had successfully dissociated his human identity from his predatory actions, creating a separate entity that could commit horrors without experiencing remorse. Detective Rodriguez became the face of the investigation, conducting daily press conferences, appealing directly to the public for assistance. She knew Roberto was watching, knew he consumed news about himself with the same hunger he directed at his victims. So she spoke directly to him through the cameras. "Roberto, I know you're listening. You can't run forever. Every hour we get closer. Every day the net gets tighter. Surrender now before anyone else has to die." Her words fell on deaf ears. Or perhaps they reached him but meant nothing to someone whose entire existence had narrowed to the cycle of hunt, kill, consume, repeat. 3 days after the raid on his apartment, another body appeared. Victim 16 was Gabriela Torres, a 19-year-old college student who made the fatal mistake of accepting a ride from a stranger after her car broke down on a lonely stretch of highway outside the city. Her body was discovered in a roadside drainage culvert, partially covered with debris in a hasty attempt at concealment. The signature was unmistakable: dismemberment, missing flesh, teeth marks. But there was something new too: rage. Where previous killings showed methodical precision, Gabriela's murder bore evidence of frenzy, of control slipping, of violence administered with wild abandon. The psychological pressure of being hunted was affecting Roberto. Good. Let him feel afraid. Let him experience the terror he had inflicted on so many others. But fear made him more dangerous, more unpredictable. A desperate animal fights with suicidal ferocity. The manhunt expanded beyond Caracas. Roadblocks were established on major highways. Airports, bus stations, and border crossings received his photograph with instructions to detain on site. The Venezuelan military deployed personnel to assist in the search. Every police officer in the country was looking for Roberto Jose Carmona. He had become the most wanted man in Venezuela, possibly in all of South America. But finding one man in a country of 25 million people, much of it covered by jungle or mountains, proved extraordinarily difficult. Reported sightings came from everywhere: Maracaibo, Valencia, Ciudad Guayana, even from neighboring Colombia and Brazil. Each report had to be investigated, resources diverted, time wasted. And while police chased ghosts, Roberto continued his predatory existence. Victim 17 emerged in November. A taxi driver named Jorge Mendez, found in his own vehicle parked in an industrial district, his body showing the familiar mutilations. Roberto had flagged him down as a fare, directed him to an isolated location, and struck. The killing was efficient, practiced, the work of someone whose skills had been refined through repetition. Despite the pressure, despite being the most sought-after criminal in the nation, Roberto's technique remained sharp. The task force received a psychological blow when one of their own, Detective Carlos Mendoza, suffered a complete breakdown. The accumulated horror of the case, the crime scene photos, the victim testimonies from families, the journals with their casual descriptions of unspeakable acts, proved too much. He was found in his office at 3 a.m, weeping uncontrollably, surrounded by case files, repeating the same phrase over and over. "We have to stop him. God help us, we have to stop him." He was placed on medical leave and never returned to active duty. His breakdown was understandable. Everyone working the case felt the weight, felt the darkness seeping into their consciousness. How do you spend your days immersed in such evil and emerge unchanged? How do you look at humanity the same way after seeing what humans are capable of? The investigation was claiming casualties even among those not directly victimized by Roberto's violence. But Detective Rodriguez refused to break. She couldn't afford to. Too many people depended on her. Too many families waited for justice. Too many potential future victims needed her to succeed. She worked until exhaustion forced her to sleep, then woke and worked again, driven by a determination that bordered on obsession. December brought both hope and horror. Hope in the form of a solid lead. A landlord in the coastal city of Puerto La Cruz reported a tenant matching Roberto's description, a man who paid cash and kept irregular hours. The tenant had moved in 2 weeks earlier, claiming to be a traveling salesman. The landlord hadn't thought much of it until seeing the wanted posters plastered throughout the city. A tactical team was assembled immediately. No mistakes this time. No warning. They would breach the apartment at dawn. Overwhelming force, no possibility of escape. Detective Rodriguez insisted on being present, though regulations technically prohibited civilian involvement in tactical operations. No one was brave enough to tell her no. The raid was executed flawlessly. The door came down in a shower of splinters. Officers poured through the opening, weapons raised, shouting commands. But the apartment was empty. Not just empty of people, empty of everything. No furniture, no personal effects, no evidence anyone had been there recently. The landlord's tip had been well-intentioned but wrong. The tenant was not Roberto, just another man who happened to resemble the composite sketches, another dead end in a case full of them. The disappointment was crushing, but there was no time to wallow in it, because that same morning, victim 18 was discovered in Caracas. How had Roberto gotten back to the capital? When had he left Puerto La Cruz, if he'd ever been there at all? The questions multiplied faster than answers. It was as if he could teleport, appearing wherever he wanted whenever he wanted, always one step ahead of the investigation. Victim 18 was particularly brutal. Miguel Contreras, a security guard found dead at his post. Roberto had approached during the overnight shift, when Miguel was alone and bored. Perhaps he posed as someone needing directions or assistance. Whatever the pretext, he got close enough to strike. Miguel fought back. The crime scene showed signs of struggle, of furniture overturned and objects broken. But Roberto overpowered him eventually, dragged him into a back room, and did his terrible work while the building's cameras continued recording empty hallways and locked doors. The psychological impact on the city was profound. If Roberto could kill a security guard at his post, could murder someone in a theoretically secure location, then nowhere was safe. Hardware stores reported shortages of locks and security equipment. Gun sales surged. People who had walked streets confidently for years now traveled in groups, eyes constantly scanning for threats. The city had become a prison of fear, and Roberto was the warden. January 2003 marked a year since the first confirmed victim. 15 months since Carlos Perez had followed Roberto into that abandoned building and never emerged. 18 bodies recovered. 8 more disappearances strongly suspected to be Roberto's work. And still he evaded capture, still he killed, still he fed his insatiable hunger. The task force brought in international assistance. FBI profilers from the United States provided analysis. Interpol coordinated information sharing with other countries. Forensic experts from Europe offered consultation on evidence processing. The resources dedicated to capturing Roberto José Carmona were unprecedented in Venezuelan law enforcement history. And finally, those resources began to yield results. A pattern emerged from data analysis. Despite the geographic spread of his crimes, despite his apparent randomness, there were consistencies. He favored certain types of locations for disposal sites. Abandoned buildings, industrial areas, places where human traffic was minimal but not absent. He needed to access his victims' bodies after death, needed privacy for his consumption rituals. This meant he required temporary safe houses, locations where he could work undisturbed. A team of detectives began mapping these locations, looking for commonalities. Rental properties paid for in cash, buildings scheduled for demolition, storage units in areas with minimal security. They cross-referenced these locations with reported sightings, with known movement patterns, with any data point that might narrow the search. And they found something. A warehouse in the Kudia district, reported as abandoned but showing signs of recent occupancy. Neighbors had noticed lights at odd hours, had heard strange sounds. But in a district where minding your own business was a survival strategy, no one had reported it to police. Until now. This time, Detective Rodriguez waited. They would not raid immediately. They would not risk another empty location, another false lead. Instead, they would watch. They would wait for Roberto to appear. And when he did, when he finally made the mistake that would end his reign of terror, they would be ready. The surveillance began on January 15, 2003. 24-hour coverage, rotating shifts, multiple vantage points. Days passed with no activity. Then weeks. The pressure to move, to do something, to act rather than wait, was enormous. But Rodriguez held firm. Patience. Discipline. They would get only one chance at this. On February 2, 2003, at 11:47 p.m., a figure approached the warehouse. Thin, wearing dark clothing and a baseball cap. He moved with confidence, with familiarity, with the ease of someone accessing his own property. He produced a key, opened a side door, and disappeared inside. The surveillance team waited 30 minutes to ensure he wasn't immediately leaving. Then the call went out. All units converge. This was it. The hunt was ending. The tactical team assembled in absolute silence 3 blocks from the target warehouse. 20 officers armed with assault rifles and wearing body armor. Snipers took positions on surrounding rooftops. The perimeter was sealed, every exit covered, every possible escape route blocked. Detective Maria Rodriguez stood in the command vehicle, watching thermal imaging of the warehouse interior on multiple screens. One figure visible, moving through the structure, unaware that his nightmare was about to end. The order came at 12:23 a.m. Execute. The entry team moved like shadows, covering the distance to the warehouse in seconds. Shaped charges were placed on multiple doors simultaneously. The command to breach came through their headsets. 3 explosive concussions sounded as one, and suddenly the night erupted into organized chaos. Police! Police! Get on the ground! Officers poured through the breached openings, flashlights mounted on their weapons cutting through the darkness. The warehouse was a maze of stored equipment and construction materials, creating dozens of hiding places, dozens of ambush points. But the thermal imaging guided them, showed them where their target was moving, trying to flee toward the rear of the building. 2 officers intercepted him as he reached what he thought was an escape route. Freeze! Don't move! Roberto José Carmona stopped. For a moment, he simply stood there, hands at his sides, as flashlight beams illuminated his face. He was thinner than his photographs, his face gaunt and hollow. His clothes were filthy, stained with substances that forensic testing would later identify as blood, both human and animal. His eyes, when caught in the light, reflected back with an inhuman quality, like an animal's eyes captured in car headlights. Hands up! Hands up now! He complied slowly, raising his arms with movements that suggested reluctance rather than surrender. His mouth twisted into something approximating a smile. "You found me," he said, his voice hoarse, cracking from disuse or emotion. "Finally, I was wondering how long it would take. Get on your knees. Now. I'm glad it's over," he continued, ignoring the commands or simply not caring. "I'm so tired, so hungry, always so hungry." He laughed then, a sound that made even experienced officers flinch. Not the laugh of sanity or humor, but something broken and wrong. "Do you understand what it's like? To be hungry all the time? To never be full, no matter how much you consume? Last warning. On your knees or we will use force." Roberto dropped to his knees with sudden compliance, arms still raised. But his smile remained. "There are more," he said as officers approached to restrain him. "Bodies you haven't found. 23. I remember each one. Every name. Every taste. Would you like me to tell you where they are?" The words sent ice through every officer present. 23. They had confirmed 18, suspected 8 more. But 23 meant there were victims still waiting to be found. Families still searching for answers. Bodies decomposing in unknown graves. Detective Rodriguez pushed through the entry team, needing to see him herself, needing to look into the eyes of the monster who had consumed her life for over a year. When their gazes met, she felt something she hadn't expected: disappointment. Not in the capture, but in the man himself. After all the horror, all the nightmares, all the unimaginable depravity, the human hyena was just a man. Unremarkable. Ordinary. Someone you could pass on the street without noticing. "Roberto Jose Carmona," she said, her voice steady despite the emotions churning beneath. "You are under arrest for multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, and desecration of human remains. You have the right to—" "I know my rights," he interrupted, still smiling that terrible smile. "I've been watching the news. Everyone's looking for me. I'm famous, aren't I? The human hyena. I like that name. It suits me." Officers moved to secure him, placing handcuffs around his wrists, checking him for weapons. He offered no resistance, seemed almost relaxed now that capture was complete. As if this was what he'd wanted all along: recognition, attention, the twisted immortality that comes from being remembered as a monster. The search of the warehouse began immediately. What they found would haunt investigators for the rest of their lives. The main storage area had been converted into a living space of sorts, a mattress on the floor, camping equipment, supplies. But the back section, separated by a hanging tarp, was something else entirely. It was a butchery. Hooks hung from ceiling beams, stained with rust and blood. A wooden table bore deep-cut marks and discoloration from repeated use. Knives of various sizes were arranged with careful precision, each one clean, each one sharp. A generator powered a refrigeration unit cobbled together from salvaged parts. Inside, wrapped in plastic and labeled with dates, were portions of human flesh preserved with terrifying efficiency. But the worst discovery came when they moved aside stacked crates in the corner. A door hidden and locked. When breached, it revealed a small room, maybe 8 feet by 8 feet, with no windows and only the one entrance. The walls were scratched, deep gouges in the concrete from fingernails torn bloody. Stains covered the floor, blood, urine, feces, the residue of human suffering concentrated into a space barely large enough to lie down in. This was where he kept them, where he imprisoned his victims before killing them, letting them marinate in fear, letting their terror season their flesh. The room smelled of death and despair, a concentrated essence of every nightmare humanity had ever imagined. Officers who entered that room had to leave quickly, overcome by the atmosphere of pure malevolence that seemed to hang in the air like fog. This wasn't just a crime scene. It was a temple to human suffering, a shrine where Roberto had worshipped at the altar of his own depravity. Roberto was transported to police headquarters in an armored vehicle, surrounded by heavily armed guards. Word of his capture had spread instantly, and crowds had gathered outside the warehouse. Not celebrating crowds, angry crowds, people screaming for justice, for vengeance, for the opportunity to do to Roberto what he had done to so many others. The police escort barely controlled the mob as the vehicle pushed through, hands banging on the windows, faces twisted with rage pressed against the glass. Roberto watched the crowds with apparent fascination, his smile never wavering. He waved to them through the window, a casual gesture that enraged them further. To him, this was validation. This was the recognition he craved. He had forced the entire city to acknowledge his existence, to speak his name, to remember him forever. The interrogation began at 3 a.m., conducted by Detective Rodriguez and a prosecutor from the district attorney's office. Roberto was Mirandized again, offered counsel, informed of all his legal rights. He waived them all. He wanted to talk. He had been waiting to talk. Where are the other victims? Rodriguez began, her voice controlled, professional. You said 23. We've confirmed 18. Where are the other 5? Roberto leaned back in his chair, handcuffed hands resting on the metal table. Do you want the chronological list, or should I go by location? I can do either. I remember everything, every single one. For the next 6 hours, Roberto Jose Carmona described his crimes with the enthusiasm of an artist discussing his greatest works. He provided names, dates, locations, methods. He drew maps showing where bodies could be found. He described his victims' final moments with disturbing detail, their pleas, their prayers, their eventual acceptance of death. And he described what came after, the consumption, the rituals, the satisfaction. He showed no remorse, no guilt, no recognition that he had done anything wrong. When asked why he killed, why he ate his victims, he seemed genuinely confused by the question. Because I was hungry, he said simply. Isn't that obvious? You eat when you're hungry. That's what living things do. But humans don't eat other humans, the prosecutor interjected. That's not normal behavior. Roberto laughed, that same broken sound that made listeners flinch. Normal? What is normal? Lions eat gazelles. Hawks eat rabbits. Hyenas eat everything, even their own kind sometimes. I'm just an animal feeding. The only difference is that I'm aware of it, that I understand what I am. Most people lie to themselves, pretend they're something special, something above nature. I don't lie. I am what I am, a predator, and humans are prey. The interrogation was recorded, transcribed, entered as evidence. Mental health professionals would later debate Roberto's sanity, his fitness to stand trial. Some argued he was clearly psychotic, operating under delusions that divorced him from reality. Others contended he was perfectly sane by legal standards. He understood his actions, understood they were illegal, understood the consequences. He simply didn't care. The bodies he described were recovered over the following weeks. Each discovery brought fresh horror, fresh trauma to the investigators who had to process the scenes. He hadn't lied. 23 victims, just as he claimed. 23 people who had trusted the wrong stranger, made the wrong decision, found themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time. Families received the news they had both hoped for and dreaded. Their missing loved ones were dead. But at least now they knew. At least now they could have closure, could hold funerals, could begin the impossible process of healing from such devastating loss. The trial of Roberto Jose Carmona began in September 2003. The evidence was overwhelming: physical evidence, documentary evidence, his own confession. The defense attempted to argue insanity, but the prosecution's psychiatric witnesses were compelling. Roberto understood right from wrong. He simply believed he existed above such concepts, that his hunger justified his actions, that his needs superseded the rights of his victims. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Testimony from surviving family members filled the courtroom with grief so thick it seemed tangible. Forensic experts described the crime scenes in clinical detail that couldn't diminish the horror of what they depicted. Roberto sat through it all with apparent interest, sometimes nodding as if agreeing with testimony, occasionally smiling at particularly gruesome details. He testified in his own defense, against his attorney's advice. For 2 days, he held the courtroom captive with descriptions of his crimes, his philosophy, his complete lack of remorse. He described himself as an evolutionary experiment, a glimpse into what humans might become if they shed their false morality and embraced their true predatory nature. "I am honest," he told the jury. "More honest than any of you. You kill animals and eat them without thought. I did the same with humans. The only difference is your arbitrary line about which species deserves protection. But lines are imaginary. They only exist because we agree they exist. I simply stopped agreeing." The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. 23 counts of first-degree murder, 23 counts of kidnapping, numerous counts of desecration of human remains. The verdict was read to a courtroom packed with victims' families, some weeping, some stone-faced, all carrying trauma that would never fully heal. The sentencing phase was brief. Venezuela had abolished the death penalty decades earlier, so Roberto received the maximum sentence possible, 30 years for each murder count, to be served consecutively. 690 years in prison, effectively a life sentence many times over. As guards led him from the courtroom for the final time, Roberto turned to face the gallery. His smile was gone now, replaced by something harder, something that revealed the truth beneath the performance. "You think you've won," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent room. "You think locking me away ends this. But I'm not unique. I'm not special. I'm just the one who got caught. There are others like me out there. There always will be. Humans are predators and predators eat. Some of us just have more honest appetites." Then he laughed, that terrible broken laugh, and allowed himself to be taken away. Roberto Jose Carmona was transferred to Yair prison, one of Venezuela's most secure facilities, where he would spend the rest of his life in isolation. The danger he posed to other inmates, and the danger they posed to him, made integration into the general population impossible. For the first few years, he gave interviews to psychiatrists and researchers, always eager to discuss his crimes, his philosophy, his complete lack of remorse. He became a subject of study, a case file in textbooks about criminal psychology and serial homicide. His journals were analyzed, his patterns studied, his methods documented with the hope that understanding him might prevent future monsters. But as years passed, he withdrew into silence. The man who had craved attention and recognition became reclusive, refusing visits, refusing interviews. Guards reported that he spent his days sitting motionless in his cell, staring at nothing, occasionally muttering to himself. The hunger that had defined his existence had finally, in the absence of any possibility of satisfaction, consumed him from within. Detective Maria Rodriguez retired from the police force in 2006, unable to continue after the Carmona case. She had given everything to stopping the human hyena, and catching him had cost her parts of herself she could never recover. She moved to a quiet town on the coast, far from Caracas, far from the memories. But the nightmares followed. They always follow. The families of Roberto's victims formed a support group, meeting monthly to share their grief and healing. For them, life divided neatly into two categories, before and after. Before, they lost their loved ones to a monster. After, they learned what true evil looked like. Some found peace eventually. Others never did. All of them carried scars that would never fully fade. The warehouse where Roberto was captured was demolished in 2004, despite efforts to preserve it as evidence. The neighbors insisted. They couldn't live with that monument to horror in their community. The land remained vacant for years afterward, nobody willing to build on ground that had absorbed so much suffering. Eventually, a community center was constructed there, a deliberate attempt to transform evil into good, death into life. But locals still avoid it after dark, still feel an inexplicable unease when passing the location. The case changed Venezuelan law enforcement. New protocols were established for investigating serial crimes. Task forces were created specifically to identify and track patterns that might indicate serial offenders. The psychological toll on investigators was finally acknowledged, with mandatory counseling and support systems implemented. Roberto Jose Carmona's reign of terror had revealed weaknesses in the system, and those weaknesses were addressed with reforms written in the blood of his victims. In 2015, 12 years into his sentence, Roberto Jose Carmona was found dead in his cell. Natural causes, a heart attack in the night. He was 53 years old. No funeral was held. No mourners gathered. His body was cremated and his ashes scattered without ceremony. The monster was gone, reduced to dust and ash and fading memory. But his victims remain. Not just the 23 who died, but the hundreds who survived him. Family members, investigators, witnesses, everyone touched by his evil. They carry his shadow with them, a permanent stain that no amount of time can wash clean. They remember when the city held its breath in fear, when trust became dangerous, when a smile from a stranger could mean death. The human hyena is dead, but the lessons he taught about human capacity for evil, about the monsters that hide behind ordinary faces, about the fragility of the civilization we build to hold back the darkness, those lessons endure. They must endure, because forgetting makes us vulnerable. Forgetting invites the next monster to emerge from the shadows. And Roberto was right about one thing, though it pains anyone to admit it. He wasn't unique. The capacity for such evil exists in the species, dormant in most, active in the terrifying few. We build laws and ethics and societies to contain that capacity, to channel it into acceptable forms, to prevent the emergence of predators among us. But sometimes, despite everything, a Roberto Jose Carmona slips through. And when he does, when the monster reveals itself, all we can do is what Detective Rodriguez and her team did. Hunt it down, stop it, ensure it can never hurt anyone again. Justice may be imperfect, closure may be impossible, but we must try. We must always try, because the alternative, accepting that monsters can walk among us freely, that human life can be consumed without consequence, is the path to darkness absolute. And if there's anything the human hyena taught us, it's that we've seen enough darkness to last a lifetime. 23 souls lost to an appetite that could never be satisfied. 23 names that deserve to be remembered, not as victims of a monster, but as people who lived and loved and mattered. Their deaths were senseless, their suffering unimaginable, but their memory serves a purpose, a reminder that evil is real, that vigilance is necessary, that the price of safety is eternal watchfulness. The case files remain sealed, available only to researchers and law enforcement. The crime scene photographs are too disturbing for public viewing, the details too graphic for casual consumption. This is appropriate. Some darkness shouldn't be exposed to light, shouldn't be made entertainment, shouldn't be commodified into spectacle. But the story must be told, not to glorify Roberto Jose Carmona or give him the immortality he craved, but to honor his victims, to acknowledge their suffering, to ensure that their deaths meant something, changed something, prevented future deaths through the lessons learned and systems improved. In the end, that's all we can do when confronted with evil on this scale. Remember the victims. Learn the lessons. Stay vigilant against the next monster waiting in the shadows. Because there's always a next monster. The human capacity for evil doesn't disappear. It merely waits for the right circumstances, the right vulnerabilities, the right opportunity. The human hyena is dead. But the night he emerged from still exists, still produces predators, still threatens the vulnerable. Our defense is knowledge, awareness, and the commitment to never look away when evil reveals itself. We must watch. We must act. We must protect those who cannot protect themselves. That is the true legacy of Roberto Jose Carmona. Not his crimes, but our response to them. Not the darkness he represented, but the light we shone to dispel it. Not the monster he became, but the humanity we preserved by refusing to become monsters ourselves in our pursuit of justice. 23 names, 23 lives, 23 reasons to remain vigilant, to care for one another, to build a society where predators find no hunting ground and monsters find no shadows to hide in. This is their story. This is their memorial. This is how we ensure they are never forgotten, and how we prevent others from sharing their fate. The human hyena is gone, but the memory remains. And memory is how we learn, how we grow, how we survive. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, Be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story to help you drift off to sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3, David and Catherine Burney, the Morehouse Street Murders. Some doors should never be opened. What happens when evil finds its perfect match? A quiet suburban street where children played and neighbors waved hello, until the day 4 young women vanished into a house of horrors at number 3. This is the story of Australia's most depraved killing couple, where love became a weapon and ordinary-looking monsters perfected the art of hunting together. David and Catherine Burney didn't just kill. They transformed their home into a chamber of calculated torture, where screams went unheard and hope died slowly. But one survivor would risk everything to escape, and her courage would finally expose what had been happening behind those ordinary walls. Tonight, we descend into one of the darkest chapters in Australian criminal history, the Morehouse Street Murders. Evil doesn't always announce itself with thunder and lightning. Sometimes it grows in silence, festering in the shadows of damaged childhoods and twisted minds that find each other across the years. This is how monsters are made, not born, but carefully constructed through trauma, obsession, and the terrifying moment when 2 broken souls recognize the darkness in each other. David John Burney entered the world on February 16, 1951, in Witcherina, Western Australia. From the beginning, his life was marked by instability and neglect. His mother suffered from severe mental health issues, and his father was an alcoholic who could barely keep the family together. By the time David was young, his parents had separated, and he was shuttled between relatives like unwanted cargo. Nobody wanted the boy who seemed odd, who watched people with those cold, calculating eyes that never quite looked right. The Burney household, such as it was, existed in chaos. David and his siblings lived in squalor, often without adequate food or supervision. While other children learned about love and security, David learned about survival and manipulation. He discovered early that he could take what he wanted if he was clever enough, if he moved through the world like a predator studying prey. His first criminal acts were small, petty theft, breaking into homes when families were away. But each successful crime fed something hungry inside him, something that wanted more. School was a nightmare of social rejection and academic failure. David couldn't focus, couldn't connect with his peers in any meaningful way. Teachers noted his strange behavior, the way he seemed to operate on a different frequency than other children. He was intelligent in certain ways, cunning, observant, but those talents were channeled into darker pursuits. By his early teens, he had already accumulated a criminal record that would grow longer with each passing year. Then, in the working-class suburb of South Perth, David met the girl who would become both his obsession and his perfect accomplice. Catherine Margaret Harrison was born on May 23, 1951, just 3 months after David. Where David's childhood was marked by neglect and chaos, Catherine's was characterized by domination and control. Her mother was an overbearing figure who ruled the household with strict religious fervor, while her father remained largely absent, emotionally if not physically. Catherine was a slight girl with mousy brown hair and an eagerness to please that bordered on desperation. She craved affection, validation, any sign that she mattered to someone, anyone. This hunger made her vulnerable to the wrong kind of attention. When she met David Burney at age 14, she thought she had found someone who understood her, someone who made her feel special. What she had actually found was a manipulator who recognized her weakness and knew exactly how to exploit it. Their teenage romance was intense and all-consuming. David made Catherine feel alive in ways she had never experienced. He was dangerous, exciting, everything her oppressive home life was not. For David, Catherine represented something equally intoxicating, complete devotion. She would do anything for him, follow him anywhere. He tested this devotion constantly, pushing her boundaries, seeing how far she would go to prove her love. When Catherine became pregnant at 15, her family intervened forcefully. They separated the young couple, sending Catherine away to have the baby, which was quickly adopted out. For Catherine, this loss was devastating. She felt abandoned, punished for loving someone. The trauma cemented her attachment to David, transforming their teenage relationship into an obsession that would endure for years. But life had other plans. Catherine eventually married another man, Donald McLaughlin, in what appeared to be an attempt at normalcy. She had 6 children with McLaughlin, settling into a conventional suburban existence that must have felt like wearing someone else's skin. All the while, something festered inside her. The memory of that first intense love, the feeling that she had been torn away from her true purpose. David, meanwhile, was perfecting his criminal career. His early crimes escalated from burglary to more violent offenses. In 1963, at just 12 years old, he committed his first recorded sexual assault. It wouldn't be his last. Throughout his teens and 20s, David cycled in and out of prison, each stint teaching him new skills, hardening him further. Other inmates noted his strange detachment, the way he seemed to lack normal human emotions. He was a void dressed in human skin, mimicking feelings he didn't actually possess. Prison psychiatrists evaluated him multiple times, noting his antisocial tendencies and sexual deviance. They used words like psychopath and high risk for reoffending, but the system kept releasing him, kept giving him new opportunities to hunt. Between incarcerations, David worked odd jobs, mostly in mechanics and manual labor. He was competent with his hands, good at fixing things, taking them apart to see how they worked. This same curiosity would later extend to human beings. During these years apart, both David and Catherine continued their separate lives, but neither could forget the other. Catherine's marriage grew increasingly unhappy. McLaughlin was a decent man by most accounts, but he wasn't David. He couldn't provide the intensity, the dark thrill that Catherine had experienced in those formative teenage years. She felt trapped in a life of domesticity, raising children, keeping house, playing the role of respectable wife and mother, while something much darker simmered beneath the surface. Then, in 1985, fate, or something far more sinister, brought them back together. Catherine was working at a local store when David walked in, and the recognition was instant. The years fell away, and suddenly they were those teenagers again, bound by that strange, dark connection. They began an affair, meeting secretly while Catherine was still married. The affair quickly became an obsession for both of them. David convinced Catherine to leave her husband and children. This decision shocked everyone who knew her. Mothers didn't abandon their children, it was unthinkable. But Catherine did exactly that, walking away from her 6 kids to move in with David at a small rental property at 3 Morehouse Street in the quiet suburb of Willagee. Neighbors would later describe it as an ordinary house on an ordinary street, the kind of place where nothing bad ever happens. What they couldn't see was what was happening inside those walls. David and Catherine's reunion wasn't a love story. It was the merging of 2 damaged psyches into something exponentially more dangerous. Together, they created a feedback loop of depravity, each encouraging the other's darkest impulses. David had always been the dominant personality, and Catherine slipped back into her role as his devoted follower with terrifying ease. They began discussing fantasies, sharing twisted scenarios that excited them both. David talked about his desires openly now, no longer hiding the predatory thoughts that occupied his mind. Catherine didn't recoil. Instead, she listened, encouraged, and eventually participated. She told him she would help him act on these fantasies, that she would do whatever he wanted. This was her proof of love, her way of showing that she was completely, unconditionally his. The house at Morehouse Street became their private kingdom, a place where normal rules didn't apply. They reinforced the door to the spare bedroom, added locks that could only be opened from the outside. They collected items that would later prove crucial to their crimes: chains, rope, knives, tape. To any visitor, these might have seemed like ordinary household items or tools for David's work. But they were being assembled with purpose, with intention. David began taking Catherine on what he called hunting trips. They would drive through Perth streets at night, looking for vulnerable young women. David would point them out, and he would test Catherine's reactions, gauge her willingness. Was she truly committed to this? Would she help him take what he wanted? Catherine proved herself again and again. She didn't just accept David's darkness. She embraced it, made it her own. She understood that she could be useful in ways David couldn't be alone. Women were less threatening when approached by another woman. They would let their guard down, accept offers of help or rides. Catherine could be the lure that drew them in. Their relationship had always been toxic, but now it had evolved into something unprecedented in Australian criminal history. They weren't just a couple who killed. They were partners who derived sexual satisfaction from their crimes, who fed off each other's cruelty. Catherine wasn't a victim coerced into helping. She was an enthusiastic participant who found her own twisted fulfillment in the suffering they would inflict. As spring arrived in Western Australia in 1986, everything was in place. The house was ready, the dynamic was established, and their fantasies had been discussed and refined countless times. Now they were ready to make those fantasies real, to transform their dark desires into even darker actions. The neighborhood remained quiet, peaceful, unsuspecting. Children still played in the streets. Neighbors still waved and chatted about mundane things. Weather, gardens, television shows. Nobody noticed the subtle changes at number 3 Morehouse Street. Nobody realized that 2 predators were preparing to hunt, that a reign of terror was about to begin in their midst. What makes the Bernie case so uniquely disturbing isn't just the brutality of their crimes, but the partnership itself. Throughout criminal history, there have been killing couples, but few have operated with such coordination, such mutual enthusiasm for the violence they inflicted. Catherine wasn't brainwashed or terrorized into compliance. She wasn't a battered woman acting out of fear. She was a willing, active participant who found her own gratification in their crimes. This is the most chilling aspect of their story, the realization that some people don't need to be forced into evil. Some people are waiting for permission, for a partner who will validate their darkest impulses and give them license to act. David and Catherine gave each other that permission. They created a closed world where their actions made sense, where cruelty was love and murder was intimacy. The stage was set. The monsters were ready, and 4 young women were about to cross paths with evil wearing a familiar face, offering a friendly smile that masked unspeakable horror. October 6, 1986, dawned like any other day in Perth. Warm sunshine, clear skies, the promise of another pleasant spring evening ahead. 22-year-old Mary Nielsen had no reason to suspect that this would be the last normal day of her life, that by nightfall she would be trapped in a nightmare from which there would be no escape. Mary was a psychology student at the University of Western Australia, bright and ambitious with her whole future stretching ahead. She was the kind of young woman who still believed in the essential goodness of people, who would help a stranger without suspicion. This kindness, this fundamental trust in humanity, would be her downfall. That evening, Mary was hitchhiking home, a common practice in 1986 Perth, which still felt like a safe, small city where bad things didn't happen. She stood at the side of the road, thumb out, expecting one of many cars to stop and offer a lift. When a vehicle pulled over with a friendly-looking couple inside, Mary felt relief. Couple was safe. A woman in the car made it even safer. She climbed into the back seat without hesitation. David and Catherine Burney introduced themselves with warm smiles and casual conversation. Where was she heading? They were going that way, no trouble at all. Mary relaxed, chatted with her benefactors, completely unaware that she had just entered a carefully baited trap. Every word they spoke, every friendly gesture was calculated deception. But they didn't drive toward Mary's home. The route changed, turned down unfamiliar streets. When Mary questioned this, David's voice changed, became cold and commanding. He told her not to worry, that everything would be fine if she just cooperated. Catherine turned in her seat, and Mary saw something flicker across the woman's face. Not concern or sympathy, but something else entirely. Excitement. The car pulled into the driveway at 3 Morehouse Street. Mary was forced inside the ordinary-looking house, through rooms that appeared normal. A couch, a television, family photos that would later be revealed as props, stolen from other homes. But then they brought her to the spare bedroom, and Mary saw the chains mounted to the wall, the locks on the door that only opened from the outside. Terror flooded through her as reality crystallized with horrible clarity. What followed was 4 days of unrelenting horror. David and Catherine took turns assaulting Mary, their crimes growing more sadistic as their confidence grew. They kept her chained, starved, subjected to degradations that served no purpose except their own twisted gratification. Catherine was particularly cruel in her treatment of Mary, as though punishing her for being young and free, for having the future that Catherine had thrown away. Throughout Mary's captivity, the Burneys went about their normal daily activities. David went to work at his job. Catherine ran errands, shopped for groceries, smiled at neighbors. They maintained their facade of normalcy while a young woman suffered behind their locked bedroom door. When they were home, they would visit Mary, and she would beg for mercy, for release, promising she wouldn't tell anyone. But the Burneys had never intended to let her go. On November 5th, they drove Mary to the Gleneagle National Park, about 50 kilometers north of Perth. She was weak, traumatized, perhaps still clinging to hope that they might actually be releasing her as they'd promised. David led her into the bushland, away from the road. Catherine waited in the car, keeping watch. When the sound came, sudden, final, Catherine felt satisfaction rather than horror. Their first murder was complete, and it had been easier than they'd imagined. They buried Mary's body in a shallow grave and returned home. That night, they celebrated their crime, their successful completion of what they'd fantasized about for so long. The murder had bonded them even closer, created an intimacy that normal couples could never understand. They had crossed a line together and there was no going back. Not that either of them wanted to. But one murder wasn't enough. The experience had awakened something insatiable. Within weeks, they were hunting again, driving through Perth streets with predatory focus. On October 20th, they spotted 15-year-old Susanna Candy hitchhiking. Susanna was just a child, a student who had missed her bus and needed a ride home. When a car with a friendly-looking couple pulled over, she thought her problem was solved. The pattern repeated with chilling precision. The friendly conversation, the deviation from the promised route, the sudden transformation from kind to cruel. Susanna was taken to Morehouse Street, chained in the same bedroom where Mary had suffered and died. The psychological torture was as bad as the physical abuse. David and Catherine told Susanna exactly what had happened to Mary, described in graphic detail what they had done and what they planned to do to her. Susanna endured 3 days of continuous assault and degradation. Catherine seemed to take particular pleasure in the girl's suffering, perhaps jealous of her youth or simply enjoying her power over someone so helpless. David filmed some of their crimes, creating recordings that would later become crucial evidence but which demonstrated the calculated, premeditated nature of their actions. On November 6th, Susanna was driven to the same area where Mary had been buried. David strangled her in the forest while Catherine waited nearby. Susanna's body was hidden in the same general area, the Burneys now establishing a burial ground for their victims. They returned home and resumed their normal lives as though nothing had happened. Neighbors noticed nothing unusual. The house at Morehouse Street kept its secrets. 3 weeks passed. The Burneys refined their technique, discussed what worked and what didn't, planned improvements for their next hunt. On November 1st, they found 31-year-old Nolene Patterson walking alone. Nolene was a mother, a woman with children who loved her and would miss her desperately. She accepted a ride from the couple, probably tired from her walk and grateful for the assistance. The nightmare repeated. Morehouse Street, the locked bedroom, the chains. But Nolene was different from the previous victims. She was older, more assertive. She fought back, tried to reason with her captors, argued and resisted in ways that angered David. He liked his victims compliant, broken. Nolene's spirit enraged him, and his violence escalated in response. Catherine watched and participated, but witnesses would later describe tension between the couple during Nolene's captivity. Perhaps Catherine was jealous of the attention David paid to this victim. Perhaps Nolene's maternal presence reminded Catherine of the children she had abandoned, stirring guilt that manifested as rage. Whatever the reason, Nolene suffered greatly during her 3 days at Morehouse Street. On November 5th, Nolene Patterson was driven to Gleneagle and murdered. Her body joined the others in shallow graves that would remain undiscovered for weeks. 3 women were now dead, 3 families were wondering where their loved ones had gone, and still the Bernies were not satisfied. The 4th victim was 21-year-old Denise Brown. On November 6th, Denise was abducted using the same method that had proven so effective. She was a computer operator with a steady job and a whole life ahead of her. The Bernies brought her to Morehouse Street, to the bedroom that now held the psychic residue of 3 previous victims' terror and pain. Denise's captivity lasted nearly a week, longer than any previous victim. The Bernies grew bolder, more confident that they wouldn't be caught. They kept Denise chained and subjected her to repeated assaults that grew increasingly brutal. Catherine seemed to be competing with David for who could inflict the most creative cruelties, as though their crimes had become a twisted game where suffering was the score. During Denise's captivity, something remarkable almost happened. David's younger brother came to visit the house. The Bernies made Denise be completely silent, threatened her with immediate death if she made any sound. She heard normal conversation just meters away, heard someone who could save her if only she could scream. But terror kept her silent, and the brother left without realizing what was happening in the spare bedroom. On November 10th, Denise Brown was driven to Gleneagle and murdered like the others. 4 young women were now dead, buried in the forest where their bodies would eventually be discovered. 4 families were experiencing the unique agony of not knowing, of hoping against hope while fearing the worst. Police were beginning to notice a pattern. Young women disappearing from Perth streets, last seen getting into cars. But they had no suspects, no leads, no way of knowing that a couple living in suburban Willagee was responsible. The Bernies felt invincible. They had killed 4 times without consequence, perfected their hunting technique, learned how to move through the world as predators wearing human masks. They discussed their crimes openly when alone, reliving each moment, analyzing what they had done. For both of them, the murders had become the central meaning of their lives, the activity that made them feel truly alive. David Bernie adapted to prison life with disturbing ease. He was housed in Casuarina Prison, Western Australia's maximum security facility. Other inmates and guards noted his complete lack of remorse, his tendency to brag about his crimes to anyone who would listen. He maintained that he had no regrets, that the murders had been the most meaningful experiences of his life. Prison psychiatrists continued to evaluate him periodically, and their conclusions never changed. He remained a psychopath with no capacity for rehabilitation. In prison, David received letters from disturbed individuals who were fascinated by his crimes. Some were true crime enthusiasts seeking details. Others were women who claimed to be attracted to him, who fantasized about relationships with notorious killers. David responded to some of these letters, enjoying the attention, the continued notoriety. He kept photographs and articles about his crimes, treating them like treasured memories rather than sources of shame. Catherine's experience in prison was markedly different. She was sent to Bandyup Women's Prison, where her status as a child killer, she had murdered 15-year-old Susanna Candy, made her a target for other inmates. In prison culture, crimes against children occupy the lowest rung, and Catherine faced constant threats and occasional violence. She spent much of her time in protective custody, isolated from the general population for her own safety. Unlike David, Catherine showed signs of psychological deterioration. Cut off from the man who had defined her entire adult identity, she seemed lost, purposeless. She wrote letters to David that were intercepted and never delivered. She expressed regret in conversations with prison counselors, though it remained unclear whether she regretted the crimes themselves or simply regretted being caught and separated from David. Her psychological evaluations suggested deep depression and possible suicidal ideation. The families of the victims struggled to move forward. Mary Nielsen's parents became advocates for victims' rights, pushing for stronger laws and better support systems for families of murder victims. They channeled their grief into activism, determined that their daughter's death would lead to positive change. They spoke at conferences, met with legislators, and helped establish support groups for other families experiencing similar tragedies. Susanna Candy's family dealt with the particular agony of losing a child. 15 years old, barely begun, entire life stolen. Her parents aged rapidly under the weight of their grief, their health declining as they struggled to process the incomprehensible. They found some solace in knowing that justice had been served, that the people responsible would never be free, but no amount of justice could fill the void left by Susanna's absence. Nolene Patterson's children grew up without their mother, raised by extended family members who tried to fill the gap but could never fully replace what had been lost. They struggled with anger, with questions about why someone would do this, why their mother had been targeted. As they matured, some sought therapy, working to process trauma that had shaped their entire lives. Others struggled with substance abuse and relationship problems, the ripple effects of their mother's murder continuing through generations. Denise Brown's friends and co-workers established a memorial scholarship in her name, helping young women pursue careers in computer science and technology. They wanted Denise to be remembered for who she was: intelligent, capable, ambitious, rather than simply as a victim. The scholarship continued for decades, helping dozens of young women, ensuring that Denise's legacy was about potential and promise rather than just tragedy. In October 2005, nearly 20 years after his conviction, David Birney was found dead in his cell at Casuarina prison. He had hanged himself using bed sheets to create a noose. He left no suicide note, no explanation, no final confession to additional crimes. Prison officials conducted an investigation and concluded that David had been planning the suicide for some time, hoarding materials and waiting for the right opportunity. The news of David's death sparked mixed reactions. Some felt relief that he could no longer consume resources, could no longer give interviews or receive attention. Others felt cheated that he had escaped on his own terms rather than serving out his full natural life in prison. The families of his victims expressed varying responses. Some felt it was appropriate justice. Others felt it was too easy an exit for someone who had caused such suffering. Catherine learned of David's death and reportedly became hysterical. Guards found her screaming in her cell, overcome with grief at losing the man who had been the center of her world. She required medical intervention and psychiatric care. In the aftermath of David's death, Catherine's mental state deteriorated further. She had defined herself entirely in relation to him, and without him, even imprisoned and separated, she seemed to lose whatever fragile psychological equilibrium she had maintained. Catherine Birney remained in Banyup Women's Prison, her life sentence continuing without possibility of parole. She aged in confinement, her health declining as the years passed. She gave occasional interviews in which she claimed to have found religion, to have experienced remorse and sought redemption. Whether these claims were genuine or calculated attempts to appear rehabilitated remained a subject of debate. The consensus among officials was that Catherine would never be released regardless of any claimed transformation. The nature of her crimes precluded any possibility of freedom. The Morehouse Street murders became a case study in criminal psychology, examined in textbooks and academic papers around the world. Researchers analyzed the partnership between David and Catherine, trying to understand how two individuals could enable each other's worst impulses. The case contributed to evolving theories about folie à deux, shared psychosis, criminal partnerships, and the psychology of female serial killers. True crime documentaries and books examined the case from multiple angles. Some focused on the victims, working to ensure they were remembered as complete people rather than just names on a list. Others analyzed the psychology of the killers, the warning signs that had been missed, the factors that had created two individuals capable of such cruelty. The case remained relevant decades later, still shocking, still disturbing, still defying easy explanations. Perth itself changed in subtle ways after the Morehouse Street murders. The city lost some of its innocence. It sensed that terrible things happened elsewhere but not here. Parents became more protective of their children, young women more cautious about accepting rides from strangers. The case served as a brutal reminder that evil doesn't announce itself, that monsters often wear friendly faces and offer helpful smiles. The suburb of Willagee worked to distance itself from its dark association. Residents grew tired of being asked about that house, about whether they had known the Birneys, whether they had suspected anything. They emphasized the community's positive qualities, its safety, its normality. But the history remained, an indelible stain that couldn't be completely washed away no matter how many years passed. Kate Moyer eventually married and had children of her own. She moved forward with her life while acknowledging that what had happened to her would always be part of her story. In interviews, she emphasized resilience, the human capacity to heal even from profound trauma. She spoke about the importance of listening to intuition, of trusting that inner voice that warns of danger. Her survival story became inspirational, proof that courage and quick thinking could overcome even the most terrifying circumstances. In 2021, Catherine Burney died in prison at the age of 69. She had been incarcerated for 35 years, spending more than half her life behind bars. The cause of death was not immediately disclosed, though she had been in declining health for several years. Her death received media coverage, but it was subdued compared to the frenzy that had surrounded the original crimes. The consensus seemed to be that justice had been served, that she had paid for her crimes with decades of confinement and separation from everything she had valued. The deaths of both David and Catherine Burney closed a chapter in Australian criminal history, but they didn't erase the impact of their crimes. The 4 young women they murdered, Mary Nielsen, Susanna Candy, Nolene Patterson, and Denise Brown, remained absent from the lives of everyone who had loved them. Their potential remained unfulfilled, their futures stolen. No amount of justice could change that fundamental fact. The Moorhouse Street murders stand as one of Australia's most horrifying cases, not just because of the brutality involved, but because of what they revealed about human nature. They demonstrated that evil could hide in plain sight, that ordinary-looking people living in ordinary houses could commit extraordinary cruelty. They showed that partnerships in crime could be more dangerous than individual actors, that 2 people could enable and encourage each other's darkest impulses. The case also highlighted the importance of survivor testimony. Kate Moyer's escape and willingness to testify ensured that the Burneys faced justice, that their victims' families received answers. Her courage prevented additional murders and demonstrated that even in the darkest circumstances, resistance and survival were possible. Her story became a counterpoint to the horror, proof that evil could be defeated, that victims could become survivors and survivors could become advocates. Today, the Moorhouse Street murders are remembered through memorials, through academic studies, through cautionary tales told to new generations. The physical house is gone, but the lessons remain. We remember to be cautious, to trust our instincts, to understand that predators exist and that vigilance is necessary. We remember the victims not just as statistics, but as individuals with lives, dreams, and people who love them. We remember that justice, while imperfect, matters. David and Catherine Burney never experienced freedom after their crimes. They died in prison, their legacy one of infamy and revulsion. The legal system worked, the investigation was thorough, the sentences appropriate. In a world where many crimes go unsolved and many perpetrators escape justice, the Moorhouse Street case demonstrated that sometimes accountability is achieved. Most importantly, we remember that survival is possible, that even the darkest evil can be overcome. Kate Moyer's story provides hope for other victims, proof that courage and determination can prevail. Her escape didn't just save her own life, it saved unknown future victims, ensured justice for 4 murdered women, and demonstrated that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary bravery when faced with unimaginable horror. The Moorhouse Street murders remain a dark chapter in Australian history, a reminder of humanity's capacity for cruelty. But they also remind us of our capacity for courage, for justice, for healing. The monsters are gone now, dead in their separate prisons. Their crimes catalogued and studied, but their power to harm finally ended. The victims are remembered, honored, their lives celebrated even as their deaths are mourned. And somewhere, life continues. Kate Moyer and other survivors build futures. Families heal as much as they can. Communities remain vigilant. The ordinary street where extraordinary evil once resided has returned to normalcy. New families living in new homes, children playing where darkness once reigned. This is perhaps the ultimate victory, that normal life continues, that evil doesn't get the final word, that light eventually returns even to the darkest places. The story of David and Catherine Burney ends not with their crimes but with their defeat. Captured, convicted, imprisoned, and eventually dead. Evil was identified, contained, and neutralized. Justice was imperfect but real, and in the end, the monsters didn't win. The survivors, the families, the community, they endured, they remembered, they moved forward. That is how we honor the dead, by living, by remaining vigilant, by ensuring their stories are told with respect and their memories preserved with dignity. Mary, Susanna, Nolene, and Denise are gone, but they are not forgotten. Their lives mattered, their deaths led to justice, and their stories continue to teach us about both the depths of human cruelty and the heights of human courage. The nightmare of Morehouse Street is over. The lessons remain. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and subscribe so you never miss the next true crime story to help you unwind. Now, let's get into our final story. Story 4. The Night Caller, a reign of terror in the darkness. Shadows hold secrets that daylight refuses to acknowledge. During the quiet hours when Perth, Australia surrendered to sleep, something monstrous moved through the streets. Something that wore a human face but had long abandoned its humanity. Between 1959 and 1963, families locked their doors believing thin wood and simple latches could protect them from the evils lurking outside. They were devastatingly wrong. One man, disfigured, dismissed, and seething with inexplicable rage, transformed an entire city into his personal hunting ground. Eric Edgar Cook didn't just kill, he shattered the illusion of safety itself. His victims never saw him coming. Their final moments arrived without warning, without mercy, without reason. This is the story of Australia's most brutal serial killer, a predator who struck with such randomness and savagery that terror became the city's permanent resident. The night belonged to him, and before his spree ended, 13 lives would be stolen, countless others destroyed, and 2 innocent men nearly executed for crimes they never committed. What you're about to hear will disturb you, haunt you, and force you to question everything you thought you knew about the monsters living among us. Welcome to the nightmare that was Eric Edgar Cook, the Night Caller. Evil rarely announces itself with trumpets and warning signs. More often, it grows quietly in dark corners, fertilized by cruelty and watered with humiliation until something irredeemable takes root. Eric Edgar Cook entered this world on February 25, 1931, already marked by misfortune. His face carried the evidence of a traumatic birth, a hair lip and cleft palate that twisted his features into what society deemed grotesque. Children can be merciless creatures, and young Eric discovered this truth early and repeatedly. The streets of Perth became a gauntlet of mockery. Other children called him Splits and Rabbit Face, their juvenile cruelty cutting deeper than any blade. They made him the punchline of jokes he never understood, the target of ridicule he couldn't escape. Each insult carved itself into his psyche, creating wounds that never properly healed. But the real horror wasn't waiting in schoolyards or playgrounds. It was waiting at home. Eric's father was a cruel man who viewed his disfigured son as an embarrassment, a defect that reflected poorly on the family name. The boy became his favorite target for violence that went far beyond discipline. When Eric's father drank, which was often, his fists became instruments of punishment for sins both real and imagined. The beatings were savage, relentless, and utterly devoid of parental love. Eric's mother, trapped in her own cycle of abuse, could offer no protection. She was another victim in a household where suffering was the only constant. The violence Eric endured wasn't quick or merciful. His father would beat him until his small body was covered in bruises that bloomed like poisonous flowers across his skin. Sometimes the attacks came with leather belts that left welts burning for days. Other times, fists connected with bone-jarring force that left the boy gasping on the floor. Through it all, no one intervened. Neighbors heard the screams but turned away. Teachers saw the marks but asked no questions. Eric learned that the world was a place where the strong devoured the weak, where compassion was a fairy tale, and where his pain mattered to no one. School offered no refuge from the nightmare of home. While other children played and formed friendships, Eric remained isolated. his deformity ensuring he stayed on the periphery of every social circle. His speech impediment made communication difficult, causing words to tumble out garbled and strange. Teachers grew impatient with him. Students mocked him openly. The rejection was absolute and unrelenting. Something began changing inside the boy. The constant abuse, both physical and psychological, was rewiring his brain in dangerous ways. Empathy, that crucial component that allows humans to recognize and respond to the suffering of others, began eroding. In its place, rage took root. Not the hot, explosive anger that burns bright and fades, but something colder, more calculating. A fury that simmered and waited for opportunities to express itself. Eric started small, as monsters often do. He tortured animals with disturbing creativity, trapping neighborhood cats and dogs and subjecting them to cruelties that would have horrified normal children. But Eric wasn't normal anymore. When he burned a church down at age 14, authorities dismissed it as juvenile delinquency rather than the warning sign it truly was. They were looking at kindling while a forest fire was building. By his teenage years, Eric had developed into a prolific thief. Breaking and entering became his specialty, though his motivations seemed to transcend mere material gain. He would burglarize homes and steal items of no real value, keeping them as trophies of his invasions. It was the violation itself that seemed to satisfy him. The knowledge that he had penetrated these private spaces, contaminated them with his presence, and left the owners feeling unsafe in their own homes. The court system cycled him through repeatedly. Reform schools and brief jail sentences did nothing to address the darkness growing inside him. Instead, these institutions simply provided him with time to refine his hatred and plan for future crimes. He learned how to pick locks more efficiently. He discovered which neighborhoods had the most careless homeowners. He studied the patterns of police patrols and identified the blind spots in their coverage. At age 23, Eric met an Australian-born woman of Dutch descent named Sally. Against all logic and reason, she saw something in him worth loving. They married and eventually had 7 children together. To the outside world, Eric Edgar Cook had transformed into a respectable member of society. He held down jobs, attended church, and appeared devoted to his family. His neighbors would later describe him as quiet, hardworking, and unremarkable. But Eric was living a double life that would have impressed the most talented actor. While playing the role of devoted husband and father by day, his nights belonged to something else entirely. He continued his burglaries with increasing frequency, violating over 250 homes throughout the late 1950s. The thrill of breaking and entering wasn't enough anymore, though. The darkness demanded more. He began adding violence to his repertoire. During some burglaries, if he encountered someone awake, he would attack them with whatever weapon came to hand. These assaults were brutal and seemingly pointless. He would beat people unconscious, sometimes taking nothing of value afterward. The violence itself had become the goal. He was testing boundaries, seeing how far he could push before consequences found him. Sexual assault entered his criminal portfolio next. Women became targets not just for theft but for violation of the most intimate and devastating kind. He would break into homes specifically seeking female victims, attacking them in their beds where they should have felt safest. The terror he inflicted went beyond physical damage. He was destroying these women's sense of security, their ability to feel safe anywhere. But even these escalating crimes weren't satisfying whatever void existed inside him. The darkness demanded ultimate expression. It demanded death. And on January 27, 1959, Eric Edgar Cook gave it exactly what it wanted. Perth was a growing city in the late 1950s, experiencing post-war prosperity and expansion. New suburbs sprouted across the landscape as young families built lives they believed would be peaceful and secure. The Australian dream seemed within reach. Stable employment, comfortable homes, safe neighborhoods where children could play without supervision and doors could be left unlocked overnight. This sense of security was comforting, but it was also dangerously naive. The city had experienced crime before, certainly, but nothing that genuinely threatened the social fabric. Burglaries happened occasionally. Assaults were relatively rare. Murder was almost unheard of. Perth residents believed their city was fundamentally different from the violent urban centers they read about in newspapers from America or England. Evil things happened elsewhere, they told themselves. Not here. Never here. They were catastrophically wrong, and their awakening would be brutal and complete. The monster they had unknowingly lived alongside for years was about to emerge fully formed, and the body count would begin accumulating with terrifying speed. Eric Edgar Cook was done hiding. The night caller was about to introduce himself to Perth, and the city would never recover from the introduction. The transformation from petty criminal to serial killer doesn't happen overnight, but the progression in Eric's case followed a horrifyingly logical path. Each crime had been a stepping stone toward the next level of violence. Each successful attack without capture emboldened him further. Each time he walked away from a victim, whether they survived or not, his confidence grew. He was developing an unshakable belief that he was somehow special, somehow immune to the consequences that bound normal people. His methodology was evolving as well. He was learning which weapons caused the most damage, which approaches allowed him to strike without warning, which escape routes provided the best odds of avoiding capture. He studied his own crimes the way a craftsman studies his work, always seeking improvement, always looking for ways to increase efficiency and reduce risk. The psychological component of his crimes also intensified. It wasn't enough to simply kill anymore. He needed his victims to experience terror first. He wanted them to know, even if only for a few seconds, that they were about to die. That moment of recognition, when prey realizes the predator has them and escape is impossible, that moment became as important to him as the kill itself. Perth was completely unprepared for what was coming. Police departments in 1950s Australia weren't equipped to handle serial killers because serial killers weren't something Australian society believed existed on their shores. Criminal investigation techniques were rudimentary compared to modern standards. Forensic science was still developing. Psychological profiling was decades away from being a standard tool. The authorities would be chasing a predator using outdated methods and operating on incorrect assumptions. And Eric knew this. He understood that he possessed advantages the police couldn't easily overcome. He could strike anywhere, at any time, using any method. He left minimal evidence because he was constantly refining his approach. Most crucially, his victims were random, chosen by opportunity rather than connection, making any pattern-based investigation nearly impossible. The stage was set. The monster was ready, and Perth was about to learn that evil doesn't always announce itself with fanfare. Sometimes it simply knocks on your door at midnight, and when you answer, death is standing there smiling. January 27, 1959, began like any other day for Nina Berkman. The young woman had no reason to believe this day would be her last, no premonition that darkness had selected her as its first offering. She went about her normal routine with the easy confidence of someone who believed the universe operated fairly, that tragedy was something that happened to other people in distant places. By nightfall, she would be dead, and Perth would have its first victim of what would become a reign of terror without precedent. Nina's murder was shockingly brutal, even by the standards of what would follow. Eric had been prowling the neighborhood when he saw her apartment. Something about it called to him. Perhaps the accessible entry point, perhaps simple random chance. He broke in quietly, his skills as a burglar allowing him to enter without raising alarm. What happened next was an explosion of violence that seemed to serve no rational purpose. He attacked her with a hatchet, bringing it down repeatedly with savage force. The blows were frenzied, excessive, speaking to rage that went far beyond what would be necessary to simply kill. Her skull fractured under the assault. Blood sprayed across walls and furniture, painting the room in crimson horror. She likely died quickly, but those final moments must have been filled with unimaginable terror and confusion. She didn't know her attacker. She had done nothing to provoke this violence. Her death was completely senseless, which somehow made it even more terrifying. Eric left the scene with minimal evidence, disappearing back into the night from which he had emerged. When Nina's body was discovered, the brutality shocked even experienced police officers. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong or a crime of passion. This was something else entirely. Something inhuman. But investigators had no leads, no suspects, and no framework for understanding what they were dealing with. They filed reports, conducted their investigation, and hoped this was an isolated incident. It wasn't, not even close. 2 weeks later, on February 10th, Eric struck again. This time, his weapon of choice was a rifle he had stolen during one of his many burglaries. He prowled the streets of Perth until he found an open window at a dwelling where someone was awake late at night. The target was Rowena Reeves, a woman doing nothing more threatening than existing in her own home. Eric raised the rifle, took aim, and fired. The bullet tore through her, ending her life instantly. He fled immediately, leaving behind a community even more confused and terrified than before. The randomness of his victim selection made pattern recognition impossible. Nina and Rowena had nothing in common. Different ages, different neighborhoods, different circumstances. The only connection was opportunity and Eric's inexplicable desire to kill. This lack of pattern would become his greatest advantage and law enforcement's most profound frustration. But Eric wasn't done. Not remotely. The monster had tasted blood and found it intoxicating. The kills were coming faster now, driven by impulses that even Eric probably couldn't fully articulate. He didn't kill for money. He often took nothing from his victims. He didn't kill for sexual gratification, though that would sometimes be a component of his crimes. He killed because something broken inside him demanded it, because the act of taking life provided temporary relief from whatever demons haunted him. On June 20th, 1959, George Walmsley became Eric's next victim. The retired grocer was simply sleeping in his own bed when death arrived through his window. Eric fired a rifle shot that ended the elderly man's life instantly. The killing was cold, calculated, and utterly without mercy. George had survived decades of life, weathered whatever storms existence had thrown at him, only to be executed randomly by a stranger in the middle of the night. The community was beginning to panic. 3 murders in less than 6 months, all seemingly random, all unsolved. People who had never locked their doors began installing deadbolts. Families who had let their children play outside until darkness fell began calling them in earlier. The sense of security that Perth had taken for granted was evaporating, replaced by a pervasive anxiety that touched everyone. But the killings were just beginning. If anything, Eric was accelerating. On August 6, 1959, he added another dimension to his horror. He committed a hit-and-run murder, using a vehicle as his weapon instead of guns or blades. The victim, Constance Madrill, was struck with such force that she died from her injuries. This wasn't an accident. Eric deliberately aimed his vehicle at a human being and accelerated. The crunch of impact, the sight of a body being thrown through the air. These images apparently satisfied something in his diseased psyche. What made Eric particularly terrifying was his complete unpredictability. Serial killers often develop patterns. They target specific types of victims, use preferred weapons, operate in particular geographic areas. These patterns eventually become their undoing as investigators recognize them and set traps. But Eric defied every expectation. He used guns, knives, axes, vehicles, his bare hands. He killed men, women, young, old. He struck in different neighborhoods on no discernible schedule. He was chaos incarnated, impossible to predict or prevent. The psychological impact on Perth extended far beyond the immediate victims and their families. Every resident became a potential target. Every night brought fresh terror. People lay awake listening for sounds that didn't belong. Footsteps outside windows, the soft click of a picked lock, the rustle of movement where movement shouldn't be. Parents checked on their children multiple times each night. Couples whispered conversations about moving away to somewhere safer, though nowhere truly felt safe anymore. Law enforcement was drowning in leads that went nowhere. They received hundreds of tips from frightened citizens, each one requiring investigation, each one ultimately producing nothing useful. They interviewed suspects who had alibis. They chased theories that collapsed under scrutiny. Meanwhile, Eric continued his night hunts, emboldened by each successful kill, increasingly confident that he was untouchable. On January 27, 1960, exactly 1 year after Nina Berkman's murder, Eric committed one of his most disturbing crimes. He broke into a home and sexually assaulted a young woman before fleeing into the night. This crime demonstrated the breadth of his depravity. He wasn't just a killer. He was a predator in every sense of the word, willing to inflict any form of suffering that occurred to him. The assaults continued sporadically throughout 1960 and 1961, interspersed with burglaries and random acts of violence. Some victims survived, though they were left psychologically destroyed by their encounters with the night caller. Others weren't so fortunate. Bodies kept accumulating, each one representing a life cut short, a family destroyed, a community further traumatized. On August 10, 1963, Eric killed Shirley MacLeod in her own bed, shooting her multiple times as she slept. The brutality was excessive even by his standards. The shots kept coming long after she was clearly dead. He was working himself into frenzies now, losing control in ways that suggested his mental state was deteriorating. The careful, calculating killer was being replaced by something more rabid and unpredictable. Just 1 week later, on August 17th, he struck again. This time the victim was 18-year-old Jillian Brewer, a young woman with her entire life ahead of her. Eric shot her at point-blank range as she babysat for a family friend. The child she was watching was in the next room, mercifully unaware that murder was happening just feet away. When Jillian's body was discovered, the community's horror reached new peaks. This wasn't just random violence anymore. This felt personal, targeted at the city's most vulnerable members. But Eric's most heinous crime was yet to come. On August 10, 1963, he committed what would become his signature murder, the killing of 24-year-old Lucy Madrill on the doorstep of her South Perth home. Lucy was returning home late from a social gathering, fumbling with her keys in the darkness. Eric approached from behind, completely silent, a rifle in his hands. Before she could even register his presence, he fired. The bullet struck her in the back, tearing through vital organs. She collapsed on her own doorstep, bleeding out mere feet from safety. The killing of Lucy Madrill galvanized the city in ways previous murders hadn't. Perhaps it was the location. Dying on your own doorstep suggested that nowhere was safe, not even the threshold of home. Perhaps it was Lucy's age and circumstances. She was young, vibrant, simply living her life when death found her. Whatever the reason, public pressure on law enforcement intensified dramatically. Politicians demanded action. Newspapers ran daily stories questioning police competence. The city was screaming for answers, for safety, for justice. Yet Eric remained free, prowling the streets night after night, selecting victims according to criteria only he understood. Each kill seemed to feed something insatiable within him, but the satisfaction was temporary. Soon he would need to kill again, and the cycle would continue. Perth had become his personal hunting ground, and he was the apex predator. The randomness of his crimes created a paranoia that was, in some ways, worse than if he had followed a pattern. If he targeted specific types of people, others could at least tell themselves they were safe. But Eric's victims had nothing in common except bad luck. Anyone could be next. Your neighbor could be next. You could be next. This democracy of terror meant everyone suffered, whether they were directly victimized or not. Families began leaving Perth, seeking safety in other cities that felt less cursed. Those who remained armed themselves, though weapons provide limited comfort when the enemy could strike from anywhere at any time using any method. Trust evaporated. Neighbors viewed each other with suspicion. Any man walking alone at night was a potential suspect. The social fabric that holds communities together was being shredded, thread by thread, body by body. Eric, meanwhile, appeared to live two completely separate existences. By day, he was a devoted family man, playing with his children and maintaining his home. His wife Sally suspected nothing, believing her husband's nighttime absences were for additional work or perhaps harmless affairs. The truth that she was sharing a bed with Australia's most prolific serial killer was too monstrous to consider. This duality is perhaps the most chilling aspect of Eric's story. Monsters in fairy tales look like monsters. They have horns and fangs and announce their nature clearly. But real monsters look like everyone else. They smile at you in grocery stores. They live next door. They seem normal, even boring, right up until the moment they reveal what they truly are. Eric Edgar Cook proved that evil doesn't need a monstrous appearance. Sometimes it just needs opportunity and a complete absence of conscience. By August 1963, Perth existed in a state of collective trauma that had no modern comparison. The city's residents moved through their days haunted by questions that had no answers. Who was doing this? Why was this happening? When would it stop? The randomness of the attacks had created a special kind of terror, the knowledge that vigilance provided no real protection because the night caller could strike anyone, anywhere, at any time. Law enforcement was under crushing pressure from every direction. Politicians demanded results. Media outlets ran stories questioning police competence and dedication. Families of victims formed advocacy groups that held public rallies demanding action. The police commissioner faced calls for his resignation. Officers working the case were exhausted, demoralized, and increasingly desperate for any break that might lead to an arrest. The investigation had consumed enormous resources and produced virtually nothing of value. Thousands of tips had been followed up, hundreds of suspects questioned and cleared. The crime scenes yielded minimal forensic evidence because Eric was careful and improving with each attack. He wore gloves, avoided leaving fingerprints, and changed his methods frequently enough that linking crimes was difficult. The few pieces of physical evidence collected, bullet casings, footprints, fiber samples, didn't match any known criminals in police databases. Pressure does strange things to people, especially those responsible for public safety. When answers don't come through proper investigation, there's tremendous temptation to manufacture them through other means. This is how innocent people end up in prison, how justice becomes perverted, how the system designed to protect us becomes the instrument of our oppression. Perth was about to learn this lesson in the most tragic way possible. On January 27, 1963, 4 years to the day after Nina Berkman's murder, a young man named John Button was driving his girlfriend home when tragedy struck. Rosemary Anderson was either struck by John's car or fell from it under circumstances that remain disputed to this day. What is certain is that she sustained massive injuries and later died. John, panicked and confused, initially told conflicting stories about what happened. This was enough for police who were desperate for any arrest to latch onto him as a suspect. But John wasn't being investigated just for Rosemary's death. In their desperation to close cases, police began theorizing that John might be responsible for other hit-and-run deaths as well, including that of Constance Madrill. The theory was absurd. John Button was a 19-year-old kid with no history of violence, no motive for random murder, and no psychological indicator suggesting he was capable of serial killing. But police needed a suspect, needed to show the public they were making progress, and John was convenient. The interrogation John endured was brutal by any standard. For hours, officers hammered at him, using psychological techniques designed to break down resistance and elicit confessions. They told him the evidence against him was overwhelming, that witnesses had placed him at various crime scenes, that fighting the inevitable would only make things worse. They offered him deals if he confessed. They threatened him with harsher punishment if he didn't. They played the classic good cop, bad cop routine, alternating between sympathy and aggression. John eventually broke. After hours of relentless pressure, exhausted and confused, he signed a confession admitting to manslaughter in Rosemary's death. He didn't confess to the other murders, but police had what they needed for at least one case. John Button was charged, tried, and convicted of manslaughter. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison for the death of the girl he loved, a crime he maintained he didn't intentionally commit. The Button case should have satisfied public demand for justice, but the killings didn't stop. This was a clue that should have prompted investigators to reconsider their conclusions, but cognitive dissonance is a powerful force. Police convinced themselves that Button was responsible for some killings but not all, that multiple killers must be operating simultaneously. The alternative, that they had imprisoned an innocent man, was too uncomfortable to seriously consider. Then came another arrest that would prove equally troubling. Darrell Beamish, a deaf-mute man with limited intellectual capacity, was accused of murdering Gillian Brewer. The evidence against him was laughably thin. consisting primarily of his presence in the general area around the time of the killing and a coerced confession obtained through interrogation techniques that took advantage of his disabilities. Beamish couldn't effectively defend himself verbally, couldn't fully understand the legal proceedings against him, and was utterly at the mercy of a system that had decided he was guilty before trial even began. Like Button, Beamish was convicted and sentenced to death, though this was later commuted to life imprisonment. 2 innocent men were now behind bars, their lives destroyed, while the real killer remained free and continued hunting. The injustice was monstrous, but it would be decades before the truth emerged and even longer before anything approaching justice would be served. Eric Edgar Cook watched these developments with what must have been a mixture of amusement and contempt. The police, the prosecutors, the entire justice system, they had no idea who they were actually looking for. They were arresting convenient suspects rather than doing the hard work of real investigation. And while they congratulated themselves on closing cases, Eric continued prowling Perth streets at night, selecting victims, refining his craft. His confidence reached dangerous levels. He became bolder, taking greater risks, killing more frequently. On August 10, 1963, he murdered Shirley MacLeod. A week later, Gillian Brewer was dead. The killings were accelerating, suggesting that Eric was losing control, that whatever compulsion drove him was becoming more insistent, more demanding. The gaps between murders shortened. The violence intensified. He was spiraling toward some inevitable conclusion, though no one could predict what form that conclusion would take. Then came the crime that would finally lead to his capture, though not in any way investigators could have anticipated. On August 10, 1963, Eric committed what would be his final murder, the shooting of Lucy Madrill outside her South Perth home. But this time he made a critical error. After the killing, perhaps emboldened by years of successful crimes, he lingered in the area. He was seen by witnesses who provided police with the first solid description of a potential suspect. The description was vague. A man of average height and build, nothing particularly distinctive, but it was more than police had managed to obtain in 4 years of investigation. They circulated the description, asked for public assistance, and hoped for a break. What they got exceeded their wildest expectations, though it came from an unexpected direction. On August 18, 1963, just days after Lucy Madrill's murder, Eric broke into a home and stole a rifle. This was routine for him. He had stolen countless weapons over the years, using them for murders and then disposing of them to avoid ballistic connections. But this particular burglary attracted attention. The homeowner reported the theft immediately, and police responded with unusual speed, perhaps sensing that weapons theft might be connected to the recent spate of killings. By sheer chance, officers spotted Eric carrying the stolen rifle near the scene of the burglary. When they approached to question him, Eric panicked. For years, he had operated with near impunity, evading capture through careful planning and good fortune. But now, caught red-handed with stolen property, his options were limited. He could surrender peacefully or he could fight. In his fractured mental state, fighting seemed like the only choice. Eric raised the stolen rifle and fired at the approaching officers. The shot missed, but it transformed the situation from a routine burglary investigation into an active shooting. Backup units flooded the area. The neighborhood was cordoned off. For hours, Eric engaged in a standoff with police, firing periodically from his position while officers took cover and tried to formulate a plan for safely ending the situation. As night fell and the standoff continued, police negotiators tried to establish communication. They urged Eric to surrender, promising fair treatment if he gave himself up peacefully. But Eric knew his life was effectively over regardless of what happened next. If he surrendered, he would face charges for the shooting at police, the burglary, and who knows what else once they started investigating his background. If he fought to the end, he would die, but on his own terms. Eventually, exhaustion and reality caught up with him. As dawn approached, Eric emerged from his position and surrendered. He was arrested, searched, and taken into custody. Police initially believed they had captured a burglar who had panicked when confronted. They had no idea they had just arrested Perth's most prolific serial killer, the monster responsible for more than a dozen murders and countless other violent crimes. The interrogation began routinely enough. Detectives questioned Eric about the burglary and the shooting at police officers. He answered with the calm demeanor of a man who had been through this process before. They asked about other burglaries, suspecting he might be a career criminal. He acknowledged some, denied others, played the game he had played many times before. Then something unexpected happened. Perhaps it was exhaustion. Perhaps it was a subconscious desire to finally be recognized for what he had done. Perhaps it was the ultimate expression of his contempt for the police who had chased him for years without success. Whatever the motivation, Eric began confessing. Not just to burglaries, but to assaults, then sexual assaults, then murders. The detectives conducting the interrogation initially thought he was lying, that this was some disturbed individual claiming credit for crimes he hadn't committed. False confessions are a recognized phenomenon in criminal investigation, with attention seekers and mentally ill individuals regularly confessing to high-profile crimes they had nothing to do with. But as Eric provided details that had never been released to the public, details that only the actual killer could know, skepticism transformed into horrified realization. Eric Edgar Cook was the night caller, this unassuming man sitting across from them, speaking calmly about murder and mayhem, was responsible for terrorizing an entire city for more than 4 years. The crimes they had been desperately trying to solve, the cases that had consumed countless resources and destroyed careers, had all been committed by this single individual. It seemed impossible that one person could be responsible for so much horror, but the evidence was undeniable. The confession continued for hours, with Eric meticulously describing murders, assaults, burglaries, and other crimes in chilling detail. He showed no remorse, no guilt, no recognition that his victims had been human beings with families who loved them and futures that had been stolen. He spoke about killing people with the same emotional detachment someone might use to describe their morning commute. The evil sitting across from those detectives wore a human face, but there was nothing human about what resided behind it. The confession of Eric Edgar Cook should have brought immediate relief to Perth. The monster had been caught, the killing would stop, justice would be served. Instead, it opened wounds that would take decades to heal and exposed failures in the justice system that demanded uncomfortable reckoning. The night caller's capture was just the beginning of another nightmare, one that revealed how easily innocent people can be destroyed when institutions prioritize convictions over truth. Eric's trial began in November 1963, just months after his arrest. The prosecution presented a case that was simultaneously overwhelming and horrifying. Ballistic evidence linked bullets from multiple crime scenes to weapons Eric had stolen. His detailed confessions contained information only the killer could know. Witnesses placed him near several crime scenes around the times of the murders. The physical evidence was supplemented by psychological testimony describing Eric as a textbook psychopath, someone completely devoid of empathy, incapable of genuine human connection, and driven by impulses he made no real effort to control. The defense faced an impossible task. How do you defend someone who has confessed to multiple murders and shows no remorse? Eric's lawyers attempted to argue diminished capacity, suggesting that childhood abuse and mental illness had rendered him incapable of understanding the wrongfulness of his actions. Expert witnesses testified about the neurological damage that could result from severe physical abuse, about the psychological fracturing that occurs when children are subjected to relentless cruelty. But the prosecution countered with evidence of premeditation and planning. Eric hadn't killed in uncontrollable rages. He had stalked victims, stolen weapons in advance, and taken steps to avoid capture. He functioned normally in society, holding jobs and maintaining a family. Whatever demons drove him, they didn't prevent him from understanding that murder was wrong and would result in punishment if caught. The law recognizes that understanding right from wrong is the crucial threshold for criminal responsibility, and Eric clearly possessed that understanding. The jury deliberated for less than a day before returning guilty verdicts on multiple counts of murder. The judge, following the law of the time, had only one sentencing option for convicted murderers: death by hanging. Eric Edgar Cook was sentenced to die, and few in Perth mourned the decision. This monster had taken too many lives, caused too much suffering, to deserve any mercy. But Eric's conviction created a massive problem that authorities initially tried to ignore. John Button and Daryl Beamish were still in prison for murders Eric had now confessed to committing. The logical conclusion was inescapable. Two innocent men had been convicted and imprisoned for crimes they didn't commit. The justice system had failed catastrophically, and the only honorable course of action was to immediately release Button and Beamish and publicly acknowledge the mistakes that had been made. Instead, authorities doubled down on their original positions. Prosecutors argued that Eric was lying about some of his confessions, seeking attention or trying to muddy the waters about his actual crimes. They pointed to inconsistencies in his statements, ignoring that memory is imperfect and details can blur when someone is confessing to dozens of crimes committed over several years. They suggested that Button and Beamish might have been accomplices to Eric, working together on some crimes, despite the complete absence of evidence supporting any connection between the three men. This obstinacy in the face of obvious injustice reveals something disturbing about institutional self-preservation. Admitting error would require acknowledging that the police had coerced false confessions from vulnerable suspects, that prosecutors had pursued convictions against innocent men, that the entire system had prioritized closing cases over finding truth. Careers would be destroyed. Civil lawsuits would follow. Public trust in the justice system would collapse. So instead of confronting their failures honestly, authorities chose to maintain convenient fictions and allow innocent men to rot in prison. Eric Edgar Cook, meanwhile, awaited his execution with eerie calm. He was housed on death row at Fremantle Prison, a facility with a grim reputation and conditions that bordered on torture. Days were spent in isolation, with minimal human contact and nothing to do except contemplate approaching death. Most condemned prisoners deteriorate mentally under these conditions, but Eric seemed oddly content. Perhaps he viewed execution as a reasonable consequence for his actions. Perhaps he was simply too psychologically damaged to fully comprehend his situation. In a move that surprised everyone, Eric began making statements about the innocence of John Button and Daryl Beamish. He provided additional details about the crimes they had been convicted of, details that matched the evidence and contradicted the prosecution's case against them. He insisted repeatedly that he alone was responsible for these killings, that Button and Beamish were innocent men whose lives had been destroyed by a justice system more interested in closing cases than finding truth. His motivations for these confessions remained debated. Some believed Eric was attempting to clear his conscience before facing whatever judgment awaited beyond death. Others suggested he enjoyed the chaos and controversy his statements created, that causing one final disruption to the system that had caught him provided satisfaction in his final days. A darker interpretation suggests he was rubbing salt in the wounds, demonstrating that even from death row, even with execution looming, he possessed power that the authorities couldn't neutralize. Whatever his motivations, Eric's statements about Button and Beamish were largely ignored by the legal establishment. Appeals filed on behalf of the two imprisoned men were rejected with bureaucratic efficiency. Judges ruled that Eric's confessions weren't sufficient to overturn previous convictions, that the original guilty verdicts had been reached through proper legal processes and would stand unless definitively proven wrong through new evidence. The fact that the actual killer had confessed apparently didn't meet this threshold. On October 26, 1964, just after midnight, Eric Edgar Cook was led to the gallows at Fremantle Prison. The execution chamber was a small, stark room dominated by the wooden platform and the rope that would end his life. A hood was placed over his head, blocking out what little light existed. The noose was positioned around his neck with practiced efficiency. The executioner had done this before and knew exactly how to ensure death would be relatively quick. In those final moments, witnesses later reported, Eric remained eerily composed. He made no final statement, offered no apology to his victims' families, showed no fear of the oblivion approaching. When the trapdoor opened and his body dropped, the rope did its work efficiently. His neck snapped, severing the spinal cord and causing almost instantaneous death. The night caller was dead, his reign of terror permanently ended. Perth breathed a collective sigh of relief. Parents allowed their children to play outside after dark again. Residents stopped checking their locks obsessively before bed. The constant anxiety that had gripped the city for years began slowly dissipating. Life returned to something approaching normalcy, though the scars left by Eric's crimes would never fully heal. But for John Button and Daryl Beamish, Eric's execution solved nothing. They remained imprisoned, their lives suspended, their futures stolen by a system that refused to admit error even when confronted with overwhelming evidence of innocence. Button would serve 5 years before being released on parole in 1968, his conviction still standing, his reputation destroyed. Beamish would languish in prison even longer, not achieving freedom until 1977, having spent nearly 15 years behind bars for a murder he didn't commit. The families of Eric's actual victims received no real closure from his execution. Yes, the monster was dead and couldn't hurt anyone else, but the loved ones they had lost weren't coming back. Children grew up without parents. Spouses faced decades of loneliness. Siblings carried guilt about not being able to protect those who died. The ripples of trauma extended outward from each murder, affecting hundreds of people whose lives were permanently altered by Eric's actions. Sally Cook, Eric's widow, faced her own unique nightmare. She had shared a bed with a serial killer for years without suspecting his true nature. Their 7 children now carried the stigma of being the offspring of Australia's most notorious murderer. The family name became synonymous with evil, making normal life impossible. Sally eventually changed her surname and moved far from Perth, attempting to build a new life away from the shadows cast by her husband's crimes. The psychological impact on Perth extended far beyond the immediate victims and their families. An entire generation grew up with their sense of security permanently damaged. They learned early that monsters are real, that evil exists and sometimes wins, that safety is an illusion rather than a guarantee. Therapists in Perth would spend decades treating patients whose anxiety disorders and trauma responses traced back to growing up during Eric's killing spree. Law enforcement underwent significant changes in the aftermath. The failures that allowed Eric to operate for so long, and that led to the wrongful convictions of Button and Beamish, prompted examinations of interrogation techniques, evidence collection procedures, and investigative methodology. Police departments began implementing better training programs, developing more sophisticated forensic capabilities, and establishing protocols designed to prevent tunnel vision when pursuing suspects. But institutional change comes slowly, and the injustices suffered by Button and Beamish would persist for decades before being addressed. Both men mounted multiple appeals over the years, each one rejected by courts that seemed more interested in protecting the system's reputation than correcting its mistakes. The legal establishment circled wagons, defending previous decisions rather than acknowledging that terrible errors had been made. Finally, in 2002, nearly 40 years after Eric's execution, John Button's conviction was overturned. New forensic analysis of the evidence, combined with Eric's confessions and modern understanding of false confession psychology, finally convinced the appeals court that Button had been wrongfully convicted. He was officially exonerated, though no amount of legal vindication could restore the 5 years of freedom stolen from him or repair the damage done to his reputation and psyche. Daryl Beamish waited even longer for justice. His conviction wasn't overturned until 2005, more than 4 decades after he had been imprisoned for a murder he didn't commit. The appeals court that finally exonerated him issued scathing criticism of the original investigation and trial, noting the coercive interrogation techniques used on a vulnerable defendant, the lack of physical evidence, and the prosecution's reliance on a confession that was clearly false. Both men received financial compensation from the state, though money cannot truly compensate for years of freedom lost, for reputations destroyed, for lives spent under the shadow of crimes they didn't commit. Button and Beamish became advocates for criminal justice reform, working to prevent future wrongful convictions and to support others who had been failed by the system. The Eric Edgar Cook case became a watershed moment in Australian legal history. It demonstrated how easily innocent people can be convicted when police and prosecutors prioritize closing cases over finding truth. It showed how cognitive biases, particularly confirmation bias and tunnel vision, can lead investigators to ignore evidence that contradicts their preferred theories. It revealed how vulnerable suspects, especially those with disabilities or limited intellectual capacity, can be coerced into confessing to crimes they didn't commit. Legal scholars and criminologists continue studying the case decades later, using it as a teaching tool for understanding wrongful convictions and the importance of safeguards in the criminal justice system. The psychological profile of Eric himself, a man capable of functioning normally in society while simultaneously being a prolific serial killer, contributed to understanding of psychopathy and antisocial personality disorder. But perhaps the most important lesson from Eric Edgar Cook's crimes is the simplest and most disturbing. Monsters are real, and they often look exactly like everyone else. Eric wasn't a Hollywood villain with obvious warning signs and clear motivations. He was a husband, a father, a neighbor, an employee, someone who seemed unremarkable until the moment his true nature was revealed. He proved that evil doesn't require a distinctive appearance or dramatic presentation. Sometimes it just requires a lack of empathy and an opportunity to act on dark impulses. The neighborhoods where Eric committed his crimes bear no markers acknowledging the horrors that occurred there. Houses where people died have been renovated, sold, lived in by new families unaware of the blood that once soaked their floors. Time moves forward, covering over the past, allowing new memories to replace old traumas. This is perhaps merciful. We cannot live in perpetual memorial to every tragedy that has occurred. But forgetting completely would be its own tragedy. The victims of Eric Edgar Cook deserve to be remembered. Nina Berkman, Rowena Reeves, George Walmsley, Constance Madrill, Shirley MacLeod, Gillian Brewer, Lucy Madrill, and the others whose lives were stolen by a man who felt nothing as he destroyed them. They were real people with dreams and fears, with loved ones who miss them still, with potential that will never be realized. The survivors, both direct victims who escaped with their lives and the broader community traumatized by his crimes, carry scars that time cannot fully erase. Some nightmares don't end when you wake up. Some fears don't fade even decades later. Some wounds, though healed on the surface, remain tender underneath, ready to ache at the slightest pressure. Eric Edgar Cook's story is ultimately about the fragility of civilization. We build societies based on certain assumptions, that most people share basic values, that conscience constrains behavior, that communities can trust one another enough to function. Then someone like Eric comes along and reveals how easily these assumptions can be violated. One person, operating alone, can terrorize an entire city and expose the limitations of the institutions we rely on for protection. Perth survived Eric's rampage, but it was forever changed. The innocence lost during those years cannot be recovered. The city learned that evil is patient, that it can live among us undetected, that vigilance provides no guarantee of safety. These are harsh lessons, the kind that strip away comforting illusions and force confrontation with darker realities. More than 60 years have passed since Eric Edgar Cook was executed. Most people alive today weren't even born when the Nightcaller prowled Perth streets. But his crimes echo forward through time, affecting descendants of victims, shaping criminal justice policies, providing cautionary tales about wrongful convictions and investigative failures. His legacy is entirely negative, a legacy of suffering, fear, and death, but it persists nonetheless. The question that haunts everyone who studies this case is the simplest and most unanswerable. Why? Why did Eric do what he did? What drove him to kill strangers for no apparent reason? Was it the childhood abuse, the social rejection, some neurological abnormality, or a combination of factors we'll never fully understand? Eric himself probably couldn't have provided a satisfying answer. His actions came from some dark place beyond rational explanation, beyond normal human psychology. Perhaps there is no why. Perhaps seeking rational explanations for irrational evil is itself a mistake. Some people are simply broken in ways that make them dangerous to everyone around them. Eric Edgar Cook was one of those people. He chose violence repeatedly, killed without remorse, and showed no capacity for the empathy that makes civilized society possible. Understanding him completely may be impossible, but remembering what he did, and learning from the systemic failures that allowed him to operate for so long remains crucial. The Nightcaller is dead and has been for decades. His body lies in an unmarked grave, forgotten by all except those who study criminal history. But the darkness he represented, the potential for human cruelty that exists in every society, remains. Vigilance against that darkness, improvement of the systems designed to protect us from it, and compassion for both victims and those wrongfully accused must be our ongoing commitment. Eric Edgar Cook's reign of terror finally ended on that October morning in 1964 when the trapdoor opened and justice was served. But the reverberations of his crimes continue, reminding us that evil is real, that innocence is fragile, and that the price of safety is eternal vigilance. Perth learned these lessons the hardest way possible. We would do well to remember them. The story of the night caller stands as one of the darkest chapters in Australian criminal history, a testament to human capacity for both horrific violence and tragic injustice. It reminds us that the monsters we fear in childhood never really go away. They simply put on human faces and wait for darkness to reveal their true nature. And sometimes, the systems we build to protect ourselves from these monsters fail catastrophically, adding injustice to tragedy and compounding suffering beyond measure. This is the legacy of Eric Edgar Cook. 13 lives stolen, countless others destroyed, a city traumatized, and lessons learned at a cost too terrible to calculate. May we never forget what happened when the night caller walked among us, and may we remain forever vigilant against the darkness that still waits for opportunities to emerge. Thank you for watching and joining us as we explored these chilling and mysterious stories. If you enjoyed the journey, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with others who love a good mystery. Also, let us know where you're watching from. I'd love to hear where in the world you're tuning in. We appreciate you being part of this, and we'll see you next time for more gripping stories. Stay safe, stay curious, and keep unraveling the unknown.